Chapter 1. The request arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a woman whose hands would not stay still. Margaret Whitfield sat in Daniel's office with the careful posture of someone holding herself together by will alone, her knuckles white where they gripped the edges of her purse. The rectory smelled of old paper and the faint, cooling wax of morning candles. The floorboards creaked with the specific complaint of a building that had stood long enough to have opinions about the people who walked upon it. Outside, late autumn had stripped the maples bare and left the churchyard grass leaden under a sky the color of tarnished silver. The wind pressed against the windows with a persistence that sounded like a voice on the other side of the glass, not threatening, merely insistent. "She speaks Latin," Margaret said. "My daughter. She's never taken a Latin class." Daniel placed his pen down. He had heard variations of this story before, usually from anxious parents who had discovered old textbooks, or from teenagers testing boundaries, or from women whose grief had sharpened their imaginations until the ordinary world seemed to lean toward the extraordinary. He had learned, after 8 years in the parish, that most things that looked supernatural had roots in the mundane. How long has this been happening? 3 weeks. It started with words she shouldn't know, then full sentences. Last Tuesday, she spoke for 20 minutes straight, and the parish nurse who was there understood every word. "My daughter doesn't know Latin. Neither I nor my husband does, nor the nurse." Daniel watched her hands tremble. He watched her eyes move from his face to the window to the floor, as though she were looking for an exit that was not there. The radiator clanked. Somewhere in the church above, a bell swung in the tower, though the mechanism was locked, and the sound faded before it reached the rectory, leaving behind it the particular ache of a bell that has rung for someone who will not answer. What does she look like when she speaks? Margaret's eyes filled. Not herself. Her face changes. Her eyes are brighter. Her voice is older. She sounds like a man. She sounds like someone who has been waiting a very long time to say something important. Daniel considered the windows. The glass was old, and it softened the afternoon into something amber and distant. He had taken this assignment partly because no one else wanted it, partly because the church had been quiet for too long, and he had begun to wonder if his skepticism was exhaustion dressed up as piety. He had attended seminary with men who spoke of possession as history, as metaphor, as a language the church had outgrown. He had left with doubts and a rosary, and the rosary had become a habit before the doubts had become a crisis. "I'll come tonight," he said. "Around 8. I want to see her before she sleeps." Margaret stood quickly, as though afraid he might change her mind. The scent of lavender perfume, sharp and cheap, lingered after she left. Daniel sat alone for a long time. He listened to the radiator. He watched the candle burn down. He thought about his mother, who had died 6 years ago, who had left him the parochial house and a small silver crucifix that hung in the hallway, which he touched every morning, the way you touch something that anchors you to a world you are no longer certain you believe in. He made himself tea. He waited for evening to come. The Whitfield house stood at the end of a lane the town had long ago stopped paving. The asphalt had cracked into webs that the weeds had claimed, and the tires of Daniel's car crunched over them with a sound like breaking bone. The house was Victorian, brown shingles and a porch that sagged on the left side, held up by a column painted white so many times the original shape was lost beneath accumulated layers, like a body beneath bandages. The porch held the silence of a home where people had stopped making ordinary noise. Daniel parked on the gravel. He turned off the engine. He sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal, to the wind in the maples, to the hoot of an owl in the trees. He picked up his catechism. He walked up the path. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. Her hands had steadied, though the tremor still lived in the corners of her mouth. Behind her, the hall smelled of lemon polish and bread that had gone stale overnight and the sour sweetness of a house where people had not been well. Robert stood in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, face closed, the face of a man who had been told his daughter was ill and who had been waiting in the dark for 3 weeks, who believed, in a part of himself he did not name, that the illness was real and not of this world and that it was his fault. "She's in the back room," Margaret whispered. "She drew pictures last night. On the walls." Daniel followed them through the house. The floors creaked with a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate, as though the house had learned to step carefully. They passed a staircase that climbed into shadow, and a dining room where a meal sat untouched, the food congealing under a lace doily, the candles guttering in a draft that came from nowhere. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, and from it came a low, steady murmur, not quite breathing and not quite speech. Claire Whitfield sat on the edge of a narrow bed. She was 16, or Daniel assumed, though her face looked younger in the dim lamplight, rounder, softer, as though the bones had not yet decided what sort of person they would build. She wore flannel pajamas printed with faded stars. Her hands lay open in her lap, palms up, as if she had just set down something heavy and was relearning how to be empty. Her hair was the color of wheat, and she did not brush it out of her face. "Claire," Daniel said gently, "I'm Father Reyes." She did not look up. She was watching something in the middle distance, something that was not in the room. "I know who you are," she said, her voice ordinary, the voice of a girl interrupted while thinking. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel's scalp prickled. The radiator clanked. The temperature in the room dropped without explanation, a cold that was not the cold of autumn and not the cold of an old house with failing insulation. It was a crypt's cold. It wrapped around his ankles and climbed up his legs with the slow decision of something that had nowhere else to be. "Who are you speaking with?" The thing wearing Claire's face smiled. It was patient, in the way a scholar is amused by a student who thinks he understands what he has only begun to read. The left hand lifted slowly and adjusted the flame on the bedside lamp. Just so, the way a careful person positions a light for reading. "She will be fine," it said. "I only borrow. I always return what I borrow." Daniel reached for his catechism. He had started carrying it again because his hands needed something solid to hold. "Are you here to be rid of me?" the thing asked, and now the voice was a man's, deep, deliberate, stating a fact the way one door states that it is closed. "I am here to understand." The thing considered this. Claire's head tilted. The smile changed, deepened, as though it had found something worth investigating. The room grew colder. The candle flame bent away from some center that was not the lamp. "You have had a long day," the thing said. "You sat in your chair until 1 o'clock. You drank water from the tap. You think I could not see you through the glass." Daniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, Claire's face had changed. The eyes were gray, holding a light that did not belong to a 16-year-old girl. Her own voice returned, small and frightened. "I don't know where I am. I don't know what I said. Please don't be mad at me." Daniel knelt beside the bed. He had forgotten how the floor felt cold and hard, the floor of a house where the foundation had settled and the builders had done their best. He took her hand. It was warm, which made the cold in the room more disturbing, because it meant the cold was coming from somewhere else. It was not the house. It was not the weather. It was a presence. "Tell me about the voice," he said. Claire shook her head. Tears gathered, but did not fall. "I don't know. I close my eyes, and there's someone there. They're not bad. They're just waiting. Like they're sitting in a chair in my head, waiting for me to finish something so they can use it. It's being patient." Daniel thought of Ambrose, retired, alone, and the story Margaret had told him about a retired exorcist who had performed a rite in 1987, and the names of the children who had spoken Latin, the names he had not yet connected. He squeezed Claire's hand. "I will come back tomorrow." She did not answer. She was looking past him at the space where the thing had settled, comfortable, deliberate, ancient. He left the house at 9:15, coat damp, mind rearranged around a question he could not yet articulate. The Whitfields followed him to the door in silence. Margaret's fingers were cold when they brushed his arm. That night, Daniel sat at his desk with the lights off and his laptop open. The house was very cold. The wind came through a crack in the window frame with a sound like a voice in a language he almost understood, and he shivered, and he told himself it was the draft, and he wrote the words down anyway. He searched for names, dead languages, repeated occurrences across time. Most results were fiction, or hoaxes, or medieval chronicles written by monks who had not yet learned to distinguish between visitation and indigestion. But there was one result. A paper published in a theological journal he had never heard of, on persistent spiritual affliction in New England agricultural communities, 1780-1960. He downloaded it. He read it twice. The language was precise, clinical, the language of men who had measured cold with thermometers and counted brushes against skin and recorded the number of hours children had spoken without pausing, and who had decided, finally, that the phenomenon was real, and that it was not one thing but many things, or rather, one thing repeating itself, patiently. in rooms that had not yet been built for the children who would inhabit them. The paper referenced earlier work, going back to 1809, to cases in towns so small they had sat unnamed on the margins of maps for decades. At 2 in the morning, Daniel leaned back and looked at the ceiling. The house held its breath. In the Whitfield bedroom, Claire slept. Or something slept in her. The lamp burned. The room held a silence so complete it sounded like the absence of all sound, as though the walls had absorbed every noise and would not give any of it back. Outside, an animal moved through the leaves. It was too big for a fox, too quiet for a coyote. It stopped beneath her window and waited. Chapter 2. Daniel returned the following evening with a recorder, a notebook, and a rosary he had not touched since his mother's funeral. The Whitfields met him at the door with the same brittle composure they had worn the night before. Robert Whitfield's hands were in his pockets, and he stared at a spot on the wall as he spoke, his jaw tight, his shoulders set like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had decided, finally, to set it down on someone else's porch. Margaret offered tea, then remembered that nobody had been drinking the tea she made, that the cups in the sink were still wet with cold liquid that no one had touched, and she took it back to the kitchen with a small, brittle sound, the sound of something breaking and not quite being able to repair itself. The house held a particular acoustic quality, Daniel noticed, not because of the walls, but because the rooms felt empty of ordinary life. The furniture was arranged, the rugs were clean, the photographs on the hallway table were in frames, yet there was no accumulation of daily sound. No radio, no television, no laughter that lingered into the next room. It was as though the family had retreated into an older, quieter way of living without deciding to do so, as though the silence had crept into the corners first, then moved to the center, and had settled there so thoroughly that even the radiators spoke in hushed, intermittent bursts, as if they, too, were afraid of being overheard. Claire was in the same room. She lay on her back now, staring at the ceiling, both hands flat at her sides, her breathing steady but shallow, the breathing of someone who is not entirely present in her own body, who is listening for a sound that the rest of the house has learned to ignore. She wore dark flannel pajamas, the stars on the pattern faded by washing, the cuffs frayed where her wrists turned. Her hair was uncombed. Her face was pale, and there was a bruise-like shadow beneath her left eye that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Daniel had not noticed it at first. It was the kind of detail that appears in retrospect, or not at all, the memory of a change so gradual it might as well have been sudden. "Claire," Daniel said. She turned her head. The left side of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, not a frown, but something in between, the beginning of an expression that was interrupted before it could complete itself, as though something else had been speaking through her face and had paused, mid-sentence, to let her finish. The light from the single lamp on the dresser caught her eyes, and they were gray, and they held a stillness that belonged to a different kind of creature, something that did not blink often, that did not need to, that had seen enough darkness already and had learned to wait inside it. "Father Reyes," she said, "you came back." "I did. You didn't sleep much. You sat in your chair and watched the ceiling until 1 o'clock. Then you went to the kitchen and drank water from the tap. The pipes rattle when you do that. Your neighbors can hear it." Daniel's scalp prickled. He did not drink from the tap. He had a filter pitcher on his counter. He always used it. He had not told anyone about the rattle, not even the plumber, who had tightened a valve and said it was normal for pipes of a certain age. The fact that she knew, that something new, did not frighten him as much as it should have. It did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like an audit, as though the thing in her head had been reviewing his habits, cataloging them, deciding which ones were worth remembering. "Is that so?" he said, keeping his voice level, the voice of a man who had been trained to stand in front of congregations and speak, as though certainty were a garment he could choose to put on each morning. "Your mother called you Danny," she said. The room became very still. Daniel heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen downstairs, a sound he had never noticed before because houses were supposed to be silent at night. And this house had been silent, and the sound of the compressor kick was the sound of ordinary machinery operating in an extraordinary place, a reminder that somewhere in the shadows below, food was being kept cold and milk was being kept fresh and the world was continuing to function with the dull insistence of things that have no imaginations. The cold returned, softer this time, colder than the air conditioning could manage, colder than the windows left open in October, colder than the stone under the church foundation. It was a crypt's cold. It wrapped around Daniel's throat and climbed up his neck with the slow decision of a snake that has found a warmer branch. And he had to fight the urge to step back, to leave, to run, because running was not the pastoral response. And running would not change what was happening in the room. And running would leave Claire with the thing that was borrowing her voice. And he had already decided, before he had even entered the room, not to leave her with it. "Who are you speaking with?" he asked again, because he had asked before, and the question was the anchor, the only solid thing he had. The thing wearing Claire's face smiled again. It was a different smile now, more tired, more deliberate, the smile of someone who has been asked the same question 100 times and has decided, finally, to answer it more fully. The left hand lifted slowly, the same hand that had adjusted the lamp last time, and it turned palm up, as if to show him that it was empty, that it was simply waiting, that it had no weapons and no secrets and no need to defend anything. "I am speaking with your mother," it said, and the voice was her voice, and not her voice, layered under the young and ordinary timbre of Claire's own. "She says hello? She says you have been lonely since—" Chapter 3. Daniel arrived at the parish archive on Saturday morning with the resigned determination of a man who has decided that the only way to survive a story is to understand it. The church was empty, which was customary for weekday mornings but unsettling on a Saturday, as though the building had forgotten people existed. The radiators clanked. Dust floated in shafts of light that fell through the stained glass, slow motes turning in rituals older than any in the Missal. The archive was in the basement. It had been a coal cellar, then a storage room for vestments during the war, then a storage room for papers nobody could bear to throw away. The stairwell descended into a smell that was at once mold, leather, and the slow, sweet decay of paper left too long in the dark. Daniel carried a flashlight and his mother's rosary. He did not know why he brought the rosary. He only knew that his hands had closed around it before he left the rectory, and removing it now would have felt like disarming himself in a room where someone else held a gun. The archive room was lined with metal shelves that leaned slightly under the weight of bound volumes, parish registers, correspondence from bishops long dead, and bundles of receipts for candles and coal and hymnals. Daniel pulled the chain on the single overhead bulb. The light was yellow and thick. It illuminated a heavy oak table scarred with initials and ink stains and the small, precise burns of cigarettes that had been smoked by men who had come to the archive before him, in search of names they already knew, in search of answers they were not certain they wanted. Beside it stood a card catalog that had not been consulted since the diocese computerized its records in the late 90s. He began with the past decade, in case Claire's case had precedent in recent memory. He pulled a parish register from 2011 and opened it to the confirmations. The names were ordinary. There were no annotations, no markings, no marginalia with strange symbols, no comments in Latin, no references to languages that should not have been known by children confirmed in a church that taught only English and the occasional responsive reading. The names were the names of people who had been present on Sundays, who had brought cakes after Mass, who had asked for help with leaky roofs and failing transmissions, and the kind of small misfortunes that fill a priest's week without ever touching the dark. He checked the registers for 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. They were dutiful. They were thorough. They were silent. They revealed nothing because there had been nothing to reveal, or because the church had chosen not to record what it could not explain, which was the same thing and had been for a very long time. He reached for a different shelf, one that held older materials bound in leather that had cracked with age and now flaked into his hands like dry skin. The oldest volume he could find without a ladder was dated 1876. He carried it to the table and opened it carefully, because the spine threatened to separate if he handled it roughly. The pages were handwritten in ink that had faded to brown, the script deliberate and careful, the handwriting of a man who knew he was writing for people he would never meet, for committees he would never join, for histories that would never be written. Daniel read through confirmations, marriages, deaths, baptisms. There were Whitfields in the early records, Whitfields who had married Crows and Abramses and Harts, who had stood as sponsors for children whose names were now names of streets and buildings and traditions that no one remembered were born from people, and who had signed the pages with crosses that were shaky and careful and human. Then, Near the back of the volume, he found an entry dated October 17th, 1809. The ink was fresher there, or perhaps the paper had been of better quality, imported from somewhere, saved for a reason. The priest's name was Father Edmund Hale. Visited the home of Josiah Whitfield. His daughter Mary, age 15, speaks Latin occasionally during prayer and at other times without prompting. She has had no instruction in the language. The air in her room grows cold. I placed a crucifix at her bedside and prayed the litany of the saints. She slept through the night. I shall return. Daniel read it twice. The handwriting was careful, the letters small and precise, as though Father Hale had known he was writing something strange and had wanted the record to be legible even if the ink faded, even if the pages warped, even if the church itself fell down around the paper and buried it for centuries. He turned the page. October 24th, 1809. Mary has improved. She remembers nothing of the speech. I will continue to watch. There was no further entry from Mary Whitfield. Daniel put the volume down. He reached for the next shelf, the one that held the registers of the remaining years of the 19th century, and he pulled them one by one, faster now, because his hands were beginning to shake, and he did not want to notice that they were shaking. 1823, August. Elizabeth Hart, age 14. Greek. The priest wrote that the girl had never been taught the language, that she spoke it with the precision of a woman twice her age, that her family had sent her away to a cousin in the next town, and that she had returned speaking English and nothing else, and that the entries after that were ordinary. The priest who buried her wrote in the margin of the death record, "She is at rest. Let us pray that the rest is true." 1847, March. Thomas Crow, age 17. Latin and what the priest described as a tongue I had not encountered before, guttural and musical, like nothing on this earth. Thomas had been suspended from school for speaking in class, for describing his teacher's childhood in a dialect that was not English, for laughing in a way that made the other children leave the room. After the priest baptized him again, the record said, the speaking stopped. 1869, November. Clara Abram, age 12. Latin. The temperature in the room dropped to a degree measurable by thermometer. Candles blew out upon the instant. Clara's parents hung crucifixes over the bed, over the door, over the windows. The bishop traveled 40 miles by horseback and wrote in private journals that the case was unlike any he had seen and that he was afraid, and he left the town without performing a rite. 1891, June. William Phelps, age 16. The boy speaks old words. I fear they are not for mortal ears. His father has taken him to the city. We have not heard from them since. Daniel worked through the afternoon. The light from the single bulb grew weaker, or perhaps his eyes grew tired. He read past the turn of the century into the 20th, and there they were, spaced irregularly, always in autumn, always in the same town, and often in the same families. Whitfields, Harts, Crows, Abramses, Phelpses, and others whose names had changed when they married, but whose blood remained. 1912, October. Sarah Whitfield, age 15. Latin. She described a house that had burned down in 1791, a house no one in the town remembered, and she described the kitchen table, the cradle by the wall, the cat on the hearth, all of which matched the description in the history book a priest had begun to write. 1928, April. George Hart, age 13. He knew things about his parents' courtship which no living soul had told him, including a joke about an ox his father told only once to his best friend before proposing. 1945, November. Ruth Phelps, age 14. Interrupted the rite. Host recovered. The thing did not leave. It merely stopped. In a later hand, written months later, it will return. It always returns. 1962, September. Peter Ambrose, age 16. Father Ambrose performed the rite of interruption. The boy did not remember. The entity left a mark on the wall that no cleaning agent could remove. The priest wrote, "It does not want to destroy the host. It wants to finish something." 1962, October, different ink. Father Ambrose believes this is the 10th such occurrence since records began. Each host completes one step of a longer work. Each interruption strengthens the next attempt in ways we do not yet understand. The boys and girls speak Latin and Greek and other, older tongues. They know things they should not know. They recover. They go on with their lives. And the thing continues. Daniel closed the book. The air in the basement was cold, and the cold was not coming from the radiators. He looked at the other volumes stacked in their careful rows and noticed, for the first time, that several had been opened recently, their pages softened by handling, their spines cracked along the edges. Someone else had been here. He carried the 1809 and 1962 volumes back to the rectory and placed them on his desk. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. The flock departed, and he locked the doors. Somewhere in the back of the building, a window rattled in its frame, though there was no wind. That evening, he called the diocese. He was placed on hold to a hymn he did not recognize. When a human answered, she told him his request had to be submitted in writing, that the board met quarterly, that the next meeting was in 6 weeks, and that he should explore psychiatric and medical alternatives first. Daniel hung up. He looked at the 2 books. He looked out the window at the rectory garden, where a blackbird stood on the fence post and did not move when he came to the glass. Later in the Whitfield house, Claire sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil. She was drawing shapes. Her mother watched from the doorway, and when she saw the shapes, she crossed herself and whispered a prayer that had no words, only gestures. Margaret put the paper away in the silverware drawer, beneath the forks and knives and spoons, and she told herself she would look at it again later, when she was not tired, when the house was quiet, when she could see the shapes clearly, but she knew, without knowing, that she would not look at them again, that the drawing would stay in the drawer, that it would be folded, that it would be there, in the dark, until someone found it, years from now, when the story had become legend, when the door had been closed, when the silence had fallen, and when the only people who remembered were the ones who had been there, who had seen, who had known. That night, Daniel sat at his desk with the lights off and the ledger open, and he thought about the names and the generations and the particular cruelty of a debt that was inherited, that was paid by people who had never contracted it, who had never agreed to it, who had been born into it the way people are born into the weather, the way people are born into the world, the way people are born into silence, and who spend their whole lives paying it, one quiet hour at a time, one cold room a time, one Latin sentence at a time, until the sequence is complete, until the door is shut, until the story is over. Outside, the wind moved through the maples. The churchyard was dark. The fox was not there. The house was quiet. The burning candle on the kitchen table smoked, then went out, and the room was dark, and the shapes on the paper in the drawer were dark, and the vigilantes in the walls were quiet, and the night was ordinary, and the world was ordinary, and for a moment, just for a moment, nothing was happening, nothing was waiting, nothing was coming, and Daniel closed his eyes and simply sat, in the rectory, in the dark, and let the silence be ordinary for as long as it would let him. Chapter 4. Daniel wrote the request on Tuesday and sent it on Wednesday. 6 weeks came and went. The days shortened. Light came late and left early. The leaves fell, the grass turned brown, and the wind came off the river with a bite that made the breath visible and the fingers stiff. Still the letter did not arrive. When it finally came, it was postmarked from the chancery in the state capital, signed by a Monsignor whose name Daniel did not recognize, a name that meant nothing to him, a name that belonged to a man who sat in an office and decided which requests were worth reading and which were worth delaying. The letter acknowledged his request. It thanked him for his pastoral concern. It suggested he continue to provide spiritual support while the family consulted neurologists and child psychiatrists in the nearest city. The church preferred to explore all natural explanations before invoking the supernatural. The supernatural was a diagnosis of last resort. Daniel read the letter twice. He placed it in the drawer with the tax assessments and did not close the drawer. He had expected resistance, but the politeness of the letter was a specific kind of cruelty, a way of acknowledging a problem without admitting it existed, a way of saying that what he had found in the archive basement was not real, or if it was real, it was not a church problem, it was a medical one, it was a family problem, and the church had no obligation to help. That night, Claire spoke for 3 hours. Margaret called Daniel at midnight. Her voice tight with terror, she was trying to turn into coherence. Daniel dressed in 3 minutes and drove to the house without lights. The house was too warm. The radiators had been turned to their maximum, and still the back room was cold, a crypt's cold that came from somewhere else. Daniel could see his breath when he entered. Claire sat up in bed, face flushed with the effort of speaking. Her mother sat in the chair by the window, hands folded, watching a spot on the wall where light folded in on itself. Robert stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the hall. "She's been talking for an hour," Margaret said. "Latin this time. Longer sentences. She never pauses." Daniel stood beside the bed and adjusted the lamp. The bulb was new and bright. Claire did not look at him. She spoke upward at the ceiling, at the empty air, as if addressing the plaster or the thing that sat in the center of the room. "Claire," he said. She turned. Her eyes were gray and still. "Father Reyes, you came. I heard your car. I heard the rattle of your pipes. You drank water from the tap at 1:30 in the morning." Daniel's scalp prickled. He did not drink from the tap. He had a filter pitcher. He had not told anyone about the rattle, not even the plumber, who had tightened a valve and said it was normal for pipes of a certain age. The fact that she knew felt less like an intrusion and more like an audit. "Who are you speaking with?" The thing wearing Claire's face smiled. It was patient, in the way a scholar is amused by a student who thinks he understands what he has only begun to read. The left hand adjusted the lamp flame, just so. "She will be fine. I only borrow. I always return what I borrow." Daniel reached for his catechism. He had started carrying it again because his hands needed something solid to hold, something with weight and edges that did not disappear when he closed his eyes. "Are you here to be rid of me?" the thing asked, and now the voice was layered, two tones sharing one throat, one young, one old. "I am here to understand." The room grew colder. The candle flame bent away from some center that was not the lamp. "You sat in your chair until 1 o'clock. You think I could not see you through the glass? You think I did not recognize the crucifix in your hallway, the one your mother gave you, the one you touch every morning?" Daniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, Claire's face had returned to its own. Her voice returned, small and frightened. "I don't know what I said. Please don't be mad at me." Daniel knelt. He took her hand. It was warm, which made the cold more disturbing, because the cold was not coming from her. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the dark beneath the window, from the shape that had settled into the room and was watching them with the patience of a librarian who had not taken a book down in a very long time. "Tell me about the voice," he said. Claire shook her head. Tears gathered but did not fall. "I don't know. I close my eyes, and there's someone there. They're just waiting. Like they're sitting in a chair in my head, waiting for me to finish something. It's being patient." Daniel thought of Ambrose, retired, alone, and of the names in the archive. He squeezed her hand. "I will come back tomorrow." She was looking past him at the empty chair by the window, at the space where the thing had settled itself, comfortable, deliberate, ancient. He left at 9:20. The lane was black. The trees pressed their branches together overhead. The fox he had glimpsed on the churchyard stone wall had vanished. He locked the door and stood in the hallway with the scribbled notes. He had never felt more watched, and at the same time more determined. That night, Daniel sat at his desk with the lights off. The house was very cold. The wind came through a crack with a sound like a voice calling out in a language he almost understood, and he shivered, and he told himself it was the draft, and he wrote the words down anyway. He searched for dead languages, repeated occurrences. Most results were fiction, hoaxes, or chronicles. But one paper appeared, on persistent spiritual affliction in New England agricultural communities, 1780-1960. He read it twice. The language was clinical, the follow-up meticulous. The pattern stretched across 7 generations. The paper went back to 1809 and left off in 1962. At 2 in the morning, Daniel leaned back and looked at the ceiling. The house held its breath. Outside, the wind pressed against the stained glass, and the radiators clanked, and the churchyard was dark, and the fox that had not been there before was now sitting on the fence post, watching the rectory with eyes that reflected the street lamp like 2 coins. In the Whitfield bedroom, Claire slept. Or something slept in her. The lamp burned. The room held the silence of a house that had learned to keep its secrets without breathing. The temperature dropped 5 degrees at 11. The shadows stretched toward the bed and stopped just short of touching her. Outside, something moved through the leaves and waited beneath her window. The Whitfields did not sleep that night. Robert sat in the kitchen with a cigarette he had quit a year ago, the ember burning in the dark like a dropped star, and Margaret stood at the stove making tea she would not drink. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had been married long enough to know what the other was thinking, that the priest had left them with a choice, that the choice was the same choice it had always been, that they would wait, and they would watch, and they would hope. And that hope was the hardest thing to hold on to when the house was cold and the silence was heavy and the daughter in the next room was speaking languages that had not been spoken in this country for centuries. Daniel drove home slowly. The road was black. The trees pressed inward. The owl he had heard on his first visit called once, then was silent, as if it had been listening for an answer that had not come, or had decided the answer was not worth delivering. He thought about the diocese letter, the delay, the name that had meant nothing but now meant a man who had decided, quietly and without malice, that the problem would go away if it was not acknowledged, that silence was a solution, that ignoring a door that was ajar would eventually cause it to close on its own. He thought about the entity, patient and thorough, waiting in the basement of the church, waiting in the room with the open window, waiting in the bedroom of a 16-year-old girl who had been drawing doors on paper and talking to shadows and learning, slowly, that the world was larger and older and most of all more patient than she had ever been told. He drove home. He locked the door. He stood in the hallway with his coat still on and his catechism in his hand and his mother's rosary on the hook where he had hung it that morning, and he did not touch it, because touching it felt like asking for something he could not name, and he was not yet sure he deserved it. He sat at his desk. He wrote the date in his journal. He wrote one sentence. The entity has marked me. He underlined the sentence twice. He closed the journal. He turned off the light. He went to bed, and he lay awake for a long time, listening to the house breathe, listening to the shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the silence of a rectory that was no longer empty, because it had been filled, quietly and without ceremony, by the story of a town and its dead, and a door that had been left ajar and had never been closed. In Claire's room, the lamp burned until dawn. At 3 a.m, she spoke one more time, just once, a single sentence in Greek, and her mother heard it through the wall, and sat up in bed and said her own name, aloud, because the voice had called her by her name, and the way it had called her was the way her own mother had called her, before the stroke, before the silence, before the world had become a place where mothers no longer called their daughters by their names, but by the kind of quiet gestures that mean I am here and I am watching and I will not leave you. And Claire did not wake, and Robert did not wake, and the candle in the hallway flickered once and was still, and the house settled around the sleeping girl, and the thing that slept beside her, and the draft that came through the window, and the cold that came from somewhere else. And for a moment the world was ordinary, and then it was not, and the ordinary moment passed, and the cold returned. And the door in the room waited, as it had waited before, as it would wait again, until the ritual was finished, or the vessel was changed, or the priest found the words to close it. Chapter 5. Ambrose was waiting in his chair when Daniel arrived 5 days later. The room smelled of lavender soap and old paper and the faint, sweet decay of tobacco stored in a jar under his bed for 3 decades. Ambrose had dressed in a black shirt with a cassock collar beneath, as though anyone might call him back to work at any moment, as though retirement were a rumor he had neither confirmed nor denied. The cane rested beside him, polished by hands that had held it longer than Daniel had been alive, and the fingers were knotted with arthritis, bent at angles that made Daniel look away quickly, because looking at the hands of a man who had stood in rooms where the cold was real and the prayers were spoken in Latin felt like looking at the map of a territory he had not been trained to navigate, and had promised himself he would not need to, until the names in the archive had changed his mind. Daniel sat. He placed his notebook on the table and opened it to the list he had copied from the archive, the names of the recorded vessels going back to 1809, and Ambrose looked at the list and nodded slowly, as though he had seen it before in dreams, or in the rite, or in the long, sleepless nights when he had sat in the rectory of the old church and watched the candle burn down and wondered whether the silence outside the window was ordinary silence or the silence of a thing that had been driven back and was gathering itself for another attempt. The names are the record, Ambrose said. The names are the body of the thing, built one vessel at a time. I didn't know Peter was your brother, Daniel said, because it was the only sentence he had, because the truth he had just learned was sitting in the room between them like a third person, like another chair, like a guest who had arrived uninvited and would not leave. I never told anyone, Ambrose said. The parish record says he was a parishioner. It says nothing about me. I have kept the true record since 1987. He picked up his cane and turned it in his hands. The wood was black with age and polish. Peter was 16. He had been speaking Latin for 3 weeks. He knew things about Father Hale, who had arrived from the city only 6 months before, who had never told anyone his wife's name was Mary, or that she had sung in the choir, or that the last thing she said to him was that he was too hard on himself. Peter told him these things in Latin, in the middle of the rite, and Father Hale dropped his Bible to the passage of Job, and he said, for the only time in his life, that he believed. I was 30, recently ordained, full of certainty. I came thinking I would cast this thing out like a thief from a house. I did not know houses can be entered in more ways than one. The rite worked. The speech stopped. Peter returned to himself. He went to college. He taught. He died of a heart attack in 1974. Until that day, he never spoke of it. But he was never all thereafter. A blankness. The entity had been removed from the vessel, but not destroyed. It moved on to the next step in the dark. Daniel thought of the note in the archive. Asterisk, it does not want to destroy the host. It wants to finish something. Asterisk, he thought of Claire, drawing shapes on paper, and the cold in her room, and the way she had described the voice as patient, the way she had said it was just waiting, the way she had said it was not bad. You said earlier that every interruption strengthens the next attempt. It does. Each pause teaches it. It studies our responses. It becomes more careful. The hosts stay unharmed. It is not attacking us. It is adapting to us. Is there any exorcist in the diocese who would know how to close the door? No. The men trained in the old rites are gone. I am the last. You are now the second. Daniel felt the weight settle into his chest like a cold stone. He had not wanted this, but the wanting no longer mattered. Claire Whitfield was 16 and sleeping in a cold room, while the thing that had been practicing for 2 centuries prepared to use her as one step in a sequence designed by people who died before electricity, before telephone, before the town had a street sign. What must I do? Read the town's founding. Learn what the settlers called, and what they called instead. Understand the door before you can close it. Daniel stood. At the threshold, he turned. Why tell me this now? Because authority prefers silence to truth when the truth is a door ajar for 2 centuries. Because I have no one left to pass this to except a man who found the list on his own. Daniel nodded. He left the room. He walked down the hallway of photographs and echoes to the parking lot. The sky was turning purple. The tree scraped its branches together, and the sound was like whispering. That night, Daniel sat in his study with the parish register open and the Historical Society's number on his phone screen. He did not call. He opened the 1809 volume and read Father Edmund Hale's entry, and he thought about the men who had stood in the same rooms and felt the same cold and wondered whether the cold was a presence or merely an absence of warmth. He fell asleep at the table. He dreamed of Latin. He dreamed of a voice he recognized but could not name. When he woke, his left hand was cramped around the rosary, and the beads were embedded in his palm. The next morning, Daniel called the Historical Society and asked for the founder's journal. The woman was not at the desk. He left his name on the clipboard and drove to the church, where he sat in the empty pews and watched the dust motes drift through the light of the stained glass. The church had been built on a hill because the founders had wanted to be close to the sky, because the sky was where they thought protection came from, because they had not yet learned that some protections come from the ground, from stones, from the careful, deliberate work of sealing what should not be opened. He thought about Ambrose's offer, the one he had received in 1987 and refused. He thought about the price of the refusal, the 12 vessels that had lived and died and gone on with their lives with blank spaces in their memories, the host after host, the pause after pause, the slow, patient accumulation of preparation. He thought about his own refusal, implicit, the way he had stood in the Whitfield house and said he did not know what the thing was, the way he had said he would find out, the way he had spent 6 weeks writing letters that no one would answer, because the answer had been there all along, in the basement, in the ledger, in the names, in the bloodline, in the debt. He went to the Historical Society in the afternoon. The librarian handed him the journal without comment, as though she had been expecting him, as though the journal had been waiting for him, as though the story had been waiting for someone to come and finish reading it. The journal belonged to Jonathan Webb, and it was bound in leather that was cracked and flaking, and it smelled of the same sweet decay as the archive. as though all the records of the town had been steeped in the same slow, patient chemistry of time and silence and a careful, methodical withholding of truth. Daniel opened it to the entry he had already read in the digitized version, the entry that described the rite, the field, the foundation stone, the children, the dead oxen, the silence. He read it again. Then he read the entry that followed, the one that was not in the digital version, the one that had been skipped or deleted or lost in the process of scanning, the one that described what happened after the rite was interrupted, the women who had fainted, the man who had spoken Latin for 3 hours, the child who had been born with a mark on its left palm, the mark that was the same mark that had appeared on the wall of Peter Ambrose's room in 1962, the mark that Daniel had not seen because he had not been there, but that Ambrose had described to him, over the phone, in the quiet hours after the rite, when the entity had already begun to speak again, not in Latin and not through a host, but through the wind that moved through the eaves of the old church, through the gaps in the floorboards, through the walls themselves. He closed the journal. He returned it to the librarian, who took it without a word and placed it back in its box. He walked out into the light. The town was the same town it had always been. The storefronts were different. The cars were different. The people were different. But the hill where the church stood was the same hill where the 12 families had gathered in 1792. The same river ran through it. The same wind came off the water. The same thing was waiting in the basement of the church, in the room where the archive had been, behind the window that had been opened from the inside, the window that Daniel had seen the night he left the Whitfield house, the window that had remained open when he arrived the next morning, as if something had been watching him, as if it had wanted him to see it, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. He drove home slowly. He did not turn on the radio. The seat of his car was cold. The steering wheel was cold. The night was cold in the way that autumn nights are cold, with a bitterness that settles into the marrow, into the joint, into the parts of the body that do not have enough blood to keep warm when the world outside turns against you. He thought about the book in his pocket. He thought about the names. He thought about the dead and the centuries, and the way evil is often just a story people have agreed not to tell each other, until someone is brave enough to read it aloud. He did not go to the Whitfields that night. He went to the rectory instead. He sat in his study. He opened the red book. He read the first page, then the second, then the third. He read until the words blurred and the letters floated off the page, and the room shook with a cold that was not the cold of autumn, not the cold of an old house, but the cold of the church basement, the cold of the foundation stone, the cold of a thing that had been waiting 200 years and was now being read about by a man who had not asked to be its next reader. He fell asleep at the table. He dreamed of Latin. He dreamed of a voice he recognized but could not name. When he woke, his left hand was cramped around the rosary, and the beads were embedded in his palm. Chapter 6. Daniel visited the Historical Society on a Saturday morning, because the building was open only on Saturdays, and because he did not want to make an appointment that would require him to explain why he needed to see the town's founding records, which would require him to explain the entity, which would require him to explain to a librarian who had spent 20 years shelving thank-you notes and condolence cards and informational pamphlets about the dangers of radon that the building she was paid to protect held in its walls a debt older than the town itself. The Historical Society occupied the old public library, a brick building at the corner of Main and Maple that had been built with money left by a mill owner who had died in 1887 and whose portrait still watched the reading room from above the fireplace. His eyes painted a pale, watery blue, his expression one of mild surprise, as though he had not expected to be dead and had decided, in the moment of his death, that he would keep an eye on the place just in case. The room smelled of glue and aging paper, and the woman behind the desk wore a cardigan that had once been blue and was now the color of faded denim, the color of a sky seen through old linen, the color of a thing that has been washed so many times it has forgotten what it originally looked like. She was the sort of librarian who had decided long ago that surprise was the only reliable entertainment left in a world that had stopped bringing her new books, and she raised an eyebrow when Daniel entered, and she waited for him to speak, because she knew, from years of practice, that the people who came into the Historical Society on Saturdays were either tourists looking for something they could not name, or locals looking for something they already knew, and that the best way to tell the difference was to wait for them to tell you what they wanted, and then to decide whether to help them or to pretend you had not heard. Founding records, Daniel said. The woman said nothing. She stood. She walked to the back of the room, and Daniel followed her through stacks that rose like cathedral aisles, the paper spines tightening the air until he felt as though he were breathing slowly, deliberately, as if inside a lung, as if the room itself were a body and the books were ribs, and the light coming through the tall windows at the end was the breath the body exhaled. The founders of the town would have recognized these shelves, Daniel thought. They had brought books with them, or they had sent for them, and they had stored them in the same church that now held the archive. And the books had sat in the cold and the dark and the damp, and they had waited, patient and thorough, for someone to open them, for someone to read them, for someone to understand what they meant. The founding records were in a box, bound in deteriorating leather, and they smelled of the cellars where they had been kept before the town built this room to hold them. The woman set the box on the table and retired to her desk with a magazine, and Daniel sat alone. He turned on the small lamp that was screwed into the table beside him, and the light was yellow and thick, like the light in the archive, like the light in all rooms where old things are kept. He read the accounts of the settlement rapidly, glancing at the weather reports, the crop yields, the lists of births and deaths, until he found the entry that mattered. It was not in the main ledger, but in a journal belonging to one of the founders, a man named Jonathan Webb, who had kept a diary between 1791 and 1794, when he died of a fever that the journal described in terms so vivid that Daniel could almost smell the sweat and the rot of it, could almost feel the blankets clinging to his own skin, could almost hear the breathing, shallow and fast and wet, of a man who knows he is dying and has chosen to write about it instead. Webb had been skeptical of the rite. He had written that he thought it foolishness and popery, and that the settlers would be better served by planting potatoes and storing firewood than by standing in a field at midnight speaking words they had copied from a book they did not understand. But he had participated because the others had insisted, because the winter of 1791 had been long, and the stores were low, and the children had begun to look like their parents had not looked when they were children, small and sharp and hungry, their faces pinched with the specific starvation of a community that had underestimated the length of the season. The rite, as Webb described it in his journal, had taken place at midnight. The 12 families had gathered around the foundation stone, which was a slab of granite that had been dragged from the river by 12 oxen, each family contributing one beast, each beast pulling with a will that the men had tried to match with their own. Each family had placed their offering, grain, salt, a strip of cloth from each household's wedding dress, a coin. Josiah Whitfield had placed a strip of cloth that he had cut from his wife's dress himself, and a coin that bore the profile of a king who had never heard of this town, who had never seen the river, who had died 100 years before the men who stood around the stone. The 12 eldest sons had stood in a circle, facing outward, not inward, because the spell was meant to push something away, to send a message to whatever was listening in the woods, in the fields, in the sky. Do not come here. We are protected. This place is ours. The words were specific. They were precise. They required that the speakers stand together and that each voice contribute to a sound that was larger than any single voice, a wall of sound that would rise into the air and push the danger back, the way a wall of fire pushes back the frost. Josiah Whitfield had read the words from his book. The other men had repeated them. The sound had gone up into the dark, and it had been answered. But the answer had not been what they expected. Webb's handwriting turned erratic at this point in the narrative. The paragraphs were short. The sentences were disjointed. He wrote of a wind that did not come from the west, and a sound like a great bell struck underwater, and a presence that was not hostile, but was not welcome, like a dog that has entered your house and will not leave, like a guest who has stayed too long and started helping himself to things from the cupboard. The men who spoke the words grew frightened. Their voices wavered. Some of them stopped. One of the women who had come to watch fainted. The children were taken home by the parents who had not participated, who had watched from the tree line with their arms around their children's shoulders, who had seen the faces of the men and had understood, without understanding, that something had gone wrong. The rite was interrupted before the men could finish. Someone, Webb did not say who, but Daniel suspected, from the way the sentences were phrased, from the careful avoidance of the first person, from the sudden shift to a passive construction that no one else in the journal used, that it was Webb himself, had struck the ground with an axe and shouted a counterword that had been passed down in another tradition, a word that was meant to close the door that the rite had opened. Chapter 7. Claire declined faster than any of the records suggested she would. The medical consultants arrived on Thursday with their briefcases and their calm, their polished shoes and their practice detachment, and they examined her with instruments that beeped and flashed and hummed, and they asked the same questions in the same tones that doctors ask when they have decided, before they have even entered the room, that the answer will not help them. And they left with prescriptions for antipsychotics and neurology referrals and suggestions for a sleep study and a family therapist. And on the drive home, they discussed the case in clinical terms, the way people discuss weather, because it was safer that way, because the alternative was to listen to the story Margaret told in the car on the way from the hospital, the story of a girl who spoke in Latin, who knew things, who drew doors on walls, and who had been asked, by a nurse who had been with the family for 2 decades, whether she believed in God. And Claire had looked at the nurse and said, in a voice that was not her own, God is a door that was left open. Daniel watched them go. He stood on the Whitfield porch with Margaret and Robert, and the wind came off the river with the same smell of wet stone and old burial. And he thought about the people who had stood on that porch before, in the years before cars, when the road was a cart track and the church bell could be heard all the way to the bend in the river, and the sound did not die in the trees but traveled, clear and strong, to the fields and the barns and the houses where people worked in the dark by the light of candles and waited for a sound that meant something, anything, had happened. She's worse, Margaret said. Her voice was so quiet Daniel almost did not hear it, as though she had been practicing the sentence for days, had been shaping it with the care one gives to something fragile, something that could break if handled roughly. She won't eat today. She says she's not hungry. She just sits there and talks. In Latin? Daniel asked. Margaret nodded. And in other things. Greek, yesterday. She told Robert he was going to burn his left hand in the workshop. He did. The saw blade slipped. She knew before it happened. She said, steady, without looking up from her newspaper, you're going to burn your left hand on the table saw. And 10 minutes later it happened. Daniel remembered the note from 1962, the one that had mentioned a boy who knew things about people's courtships and deaths, about events that had occurred before the boy was born, before his parents had met, before the town had been built. The entity was not merely fluent. It was observant. It was gathering information, perhaps to use, perhaps simply because it had been waiting a long time and there was nothing else to do, and watching the inhabitants of the world was a way to pass the time. The way a prisoner learns to count the bricks in the wall, the way a monk learns to repeat the names of saints, the way a child learns the names of the birds. He visited that night. The Whitfields were in the dining room, sitting around a table where a meal had been served but not eaten, the plates pushed to the edges of the table, the food congealing under lace doilies that her grandmother had crocheted, that had been laundered and ironed and placed on the table for a Christmas dinner that had never happened, that would never happen now. Claire was in the same room she had been in since the beginning, the room at the end of the hall, the room where the lamp was brighter now, plugged into a different outlet, because this one had stopped working the way it was supposed to, because the wiring in the house was old, because the house was old, because the house was not built for a girl who spoke in languages that predated the house itself. Claire sat on the floor, cross-legged, surrounded by scraps of paper. She was writing on them with a pencil that had grown short in her hand, the eraser almost gone, the wood worn smooth by the pressure of her fingers. She did not look up when Daniel entered. She continued writing, the pencil moving across the paper with a speed that was not human, not quite, too fast to be faked, too deliberate to be a spasm, too certain to be the hand of a 16-year-old girl who had once drawn stick figures and hearts and the names of boys she liked in the margins of her notebooks. Claire, Daniel said, and his voice was quiet, softer than he intended, softer than he had intended the night he came to the house to investigate a girl who was speaking a dead language, softer than he had intended for anything, because walking into the Whitfield house had changed the timbre of his voice, had given it a particular, cautious quality. The quality of a man who has learned that some rooms are different from other rooms, that some walls listen, that some air is not merely air but something else, something breathable, something waiting. She stopped. She turned a page over and began writing on the other side. The paper crinkled. The sound was sharp in the still room. I am learning, she said. Not the entity's voice. Her own. Tired, thin, the voice of someone who had been listening to things for weeks and had started to think they were normal, had started to wonder whether the voice was not the thing that was strange, but the silence that had preceded it, the silence that fell over the house when the voice was not speaking, a silence so complete it was almost a presence, almost a person, almost a guest. What are you learning? Daniel asked. The words. They have a shape. Like buildings. Like rooms. When I say them right, I can feel the next one waiting, the way you feel the walls of a room before you have seen them, the way you know a door is there before you touch it. They are not random. They are ordered. They are a sequence. I am only part way through. Daniel knelt. He picked up the nearest piece of paper. The writing was small, dense, and it was in a hand that was not Claire's, a hand formed from a script that had not been taught in any school in this country for centuries. A script that belonged to men who had copied manuscripts by candlelight, who had written with pens made from the feathers of birds they had caught in nets, who had preserved words through famines and fires and wars that had burned the buildings that held them. He recognized the shape of them from the ledger in the Historical Society, from the incomplete rite, from the markings on the margins of the parish register and the edges of the journal Jonathan Webb had kept. What does this say? Daniel asked, holding the paper out, though he knew, without knowing, that he could not read it with the natural eye, that it required other knowledge, other sight, other memory. Claire looked at the paper over his shoulder. She read it aloud, and he heard the words, and they were Latin, but Latin structured in a way that made Daniel's skin crawl, because the grammar was wrong and the sense was right, and the overall effect was of something speaking through a language it had borrowed, the way a ventriloquist borrows a mouth, the way a thief borrows a key, the way a ghost borrows a house. It is the first stanza of the rite, Claire said. She spoke the words slowly, deliberately, as if teaching a language, as if writing the words into the air. The part that calls the guardian. They missed the rest. They should have finished it. If you begin something, you must finish it. Otherwise it sits in the world like a door left open. Daniel set the paper down. The room was colder than it had been the night before, and the cold had a direction now. It came from the paper. It rose from the words as if they were a fire, but a fire that absorbed heat instead of giving it, that pulled warmth from the air and the walls and the body of the priest who knelt on the floor beside a 16-year-old girl who was drawing the architecture of a door that had been standing ajar for 230 years. Claire, Daniel said, who is speaking through you? She shook her head. Tears came, sudden, without warning, and they rolled down her cheeks and fell onto the paper, staining the letters, blurring the ink, turning the precise lines of the script into something softer, something human, something that could be smudged, something that could be changed. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know who it is. It's not bad. It's just lost. It's been waiting so long. I feel sorry for it. Daniel did not reply. He could not. The idea of pitying an entity that had been using human beings as stepping stones for 200 years was absurd, and yet he understood it, because the entity was not malicious. It was merely thorough. It was a tool that had been left in the rain, and it was rusting, and it was trying to complete the task it had been built for, the way a soldier finishes a war that has already been declared over, the way a letter keeps coming because the sender does not know the addressee has moved. He left the house at 10. On the drive home, he passed the church. The steeple was dark. The parking lot was empty. He would not have noticed anything odd if he had not been looking for it, because the eye sees what it expects to see, and the brain fills in the gaps, and the night is full of shadows that look like windows, and windows that look like open doors, and doors that look like invitations. But he was looking. He was looking carefully, and he saw that the basement window, the one that led to the archive, was open. It was a ground-level window, set low in the brick, and it had been bolted shut since the church installed security lights in 1998, which meant someone had opened it from the inside, or the bolt had been broken, or a hand had reached through it from the dark within and pushed it outward, careful and deliberate and slow, the way a hand opens a door when it knows it is being watched, when it wants to be seen, when it wants to make sure that the next person who walks past will understand, without understanding, that something is no longer contained. He drove past the church without stopping. He did not look back. He went home. He did not sleep. He sat in his study with the ledger and the incomplete rite and the list of names, and he thought about the 13th step, the vessel that had not yet been named, and the way the entity had chosen to reveal an open window to a priest who had been looking for reasons to believe. Later in the Whitfield house, Claire continued writing. The pencil shortened. The pile of papers grew, covering the table, the floor, the carpet, the hem of her pajamas. Her mother brought soup to the door, and Claire did not drink it. Her father sat in the hallway and smoked cigarettes he had quit a year ago, the smoke drifting under the door, curling in the corridor like a slow question, like a thought that had not yet found its words. At 2 in the morning, the temperature in Claire's room dropped to a degree that made the ink freeze before it could dry. 2 voices spoke simultaneously, one young and one old, one Claire's and one not. And the sentence they spoke together was in Latin, and it was the same sentence Daniel had seen in the journal, the same sentence that had been interrupted in 1792, the same sentence that had begun the rite and had never been finished, and the walls of the room absorbed the sound without echoing, as though the words were returning to their source, as though the girl and the voice and the room and the house were together, a vessel, and the vessel was filling, slowly, deliberately, with the syllables of a ritual that had been waiting a very long time to be completed. Claire slept, or appeared to sleep. The entity rested. Outside, the open window in the church basement remained open. The darkness poured out of it, slow and steady, into the night, into the churchyard, into the trees, into the river, into the world that continued, oblivious, ordinary, unchanged, while beneath the feet of the town, a door stood ajar, and the air moved through it, and the silence poured out like water. Chapter 8. Daniel went to the Historical Society again on Monday. The librarian was not at the desk when he entered, but a sign asked him to write his name on a clipboard and to return any books he had taken, although he had not taken any. He wrote his name and went directly to the back, where the founding records waited in their box, and where the smell of old glue and decomposition was so strong it felt like a physical presence pressing against his chest, a presence so dense it had weight, so dark it had color, so old it had a voice. He read the accounts of the settlement rapidly, glancing at the weather reports, the crop yields, the lists of births and deaths, the entries that passed without note, that did not mention the rite, that did not mention the families, that did not mention the silence that had fallen over the town after the night the rite had been performed, a silence so complete it had been recorded, a silence so unusual that a man named Father Edmund Hale had written about it, had written that the church had not rung its bell for 11 days, that the cows had not lowed, that the river had not made its ordinary sound, that the world had held its breath, and that when it finally exhaled, something was missing. Then he found the entry that mattered. It was not in the main ledger, but in a journal belonging to one of the founders, a man named Jonathan Webb, who had kept a diary between 1791 and 1794, when he died of a fever that the journal described in terms so vivid that Daniel could almost smell the sweat and the rot of it, could almost feel the blankets clinging to his own skin, could almost hear the breathing, shallow and fast and wet, of a man who knows he is dying and has chosen to write about it instead, who has chosen to put down on paper what he had seen, what he had done, what he had failed to do. Webb had been skeptical of the rite. He had written that he thought it foolishness and popery, and that the settlers would be better served by planting potatoes and storing firewood than by standing in a field at midnight speaking words they had copied from a book they did not understand, from a traveling preacher who had passed through the valley in the spring of 1791 and had left behind him, or so the story went, a single page of instructions, a page that spoke of protection and warding and the kinds of magic that men use when they are afraid of the dark, when they have not yet invented streetlights, when the forest is still full of things they cannot name. But the rite, as Webb described it in his journal, had been performed nonetheless. It had taken place at midnight. The 12 families had gathered around the foundation stone, which was a slab of granite that had been dragged from the river by 12 oxen, each family contributing one beast, each beast pulling with a will that the men had tried to match with their own. Each family had placed their offering, grain, salt, a strip of cloth from each household's wedding dress, a coin. Josiah Whitfield had placed a strip of cloth that he had cut from his wife's dress himself, and a coin that bore the profile of a king who had never heard of this town, who had never seen the river, who had died 100 years before the men who stood around the stone. The 12 eldest sons had stood in a circle, facing outward, not inward, because the spell was meant to push something away, to send a message to whatever was listening in the woods, in the fields, in the sky. Do not come here. We are protected. This place is ours. The words were specific. They were precise. They required that the speakers stand together and that each voice contribute to a sound that was larger than any single voice, a wall of sound that would rise into the air and push the danger back, the way a wall of fire pushes back the frost. Josiah Whitfield had read the words from his book. The other men had repeated them. The sound had gone up into the dark, and it had been answered. But the answer had not been what they expected. Webb's handwriting turned erratic at this point in the narrative. The paragraphs were short. The sentences were disjointed. He wrote of a wind that did not come from the west, and a sound like a great bell struck underwater, and a presence that was not hostile, but was not welcome, like a dog that has entered your house and will not leave, like a guest who has stayed too long and started helping himself to things from the cupboard. The men who spoke the words grew frightened. Their voices wavered. Some of them stopped. One of the women who had come to watch fainted. The children were taken home by the parents who had not participated, who had watched from the tree line with their arms around their children's shoulders, who had seen the faces of the men and had understood, without understanding, that something had gone wrong. The rite was interrupted before the men could finish. Someone, Webb did not say who, but Daniel suspected, from the careful avoidance of the first person, from the sudden shift to a passive construction that no one else in the journal used, that it was Webb himself, had struck the ground with an axe and shouted a counterword that had been passed down in another tradition, a word that was meant to close the door that the rite had opened. But the counterword did not work. Or rather, it worked, but not completely. It drove the summoned thing back, but it left the door ajar. Webb described the aftermath as a stillness, as if the world had stopped breathing for a moment, and when it started again, something had changed in the rhythm of the breath, something had fallen out of step. The oxen were gone. One of the men, a hart, had fallen to his knees and spoken Latin for 3 hours straight, until his voice was gone, until his tongue was swollen, until he could no longer form the words. Another man's wife had given birth that night to a child who died at dawn. Josiah Whitfield had walked home with his head down, and he had not spoken again for a year. Webb did not say what became of the counterword. He did not say whether anyone had tried to use it again. He simply wrote, in the final entry of the journal, in a hand that had become so shaky it was nearly illegible, "We have made a door. I fear what will come through it. I fear what is already coming through. Forgive me." The journal ended there. Webb died 3 months later, in the same fever that killed so many that year, and his journal was passed to his brother, who had been at the rite but had not spoken of it, who had stored it in a chest in the attic of a house that no longer exists, and the chest had been passed down, and eventually the journal had found its way to the Historical Society, where it had sat in a box, unread, for 200 years. Daniel closed the book. His hands were shaking. The librarian had returned and was shelving books at the far end of the room, but she was watching him. Daniel could tell, because people who spend their lives in rooms full of dead voices learn to read the faces of the living who disturb them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She returned to her pages. He copied the incomplete right into his notebook. He noted the names of the 12 families present at the original meeting. He noticed, after a moment, that the Whitfields, Claire's ancestors on her father's side, the ones who had been present, who had spoken the empty words, who had stood in the circle with Josiah and his coin and his strip of cloth, still owned the land the town had granted them, the house where Claire now slept with the cold in her room and the shapes on her paper. He returned the journal to the box. He thanked the librarian, who said nothing. He walked out into the light. The sky was the color of an old bruise, yellow and purple and bruised gray, the sky of a day that had decided, somewhere around noon, that it would like to end early, that it had said enough, that it was tired. The town was the same town it had always been. The storefronts were different. The cars were different. The people were different. But the hill where the church stood was the same hill where the 12 families had gathered in 1792. The same river ran through it. The same wind came off the water. The same thing was waiting in the basement of the church, in the room where the archive had been, behind the window that had been opened from the inside, the window that Daniel had seen the night he left the Whitfield house, the window that had remained open when he arrived the next morning, as if something had been watching him, as if it had wanted him to see it, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. He drove to the church. He parked. He walked around the building to the basement window. It was still open. The air coming out of it was cold, and it smelled of old stone and a sweetness that was not the sweetness of flowers, but something closer to the sweetness of decay, of bodies that had rested underground for a very long time, of the slow, patient chemistry of things that had been left in the dark and had learned to survive in it. He leaned in. The darkness inside was complete. He could not see the floor. He could not see the shelves. He could not see anything. But he could feel something there, watching him, or perhaps merely observing him with the slow curiosity of a creature that had not seen a priest in many, many years, that had not been approached with the particular combination of skepticism and dread that Daniel carried, and was learning and would not abandon. He whispered something into the darkness. He did not know what he whispered. He only knew that it was a word, a name, a counterword perhaps, or simply a sound, a syllable, a breath shaped into meaning and released into the dark. He waited. He heard nothing. He walked back to his car. He drove home. In the Whitfield house, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. The overhead light was on, and it was bright, and it fell across the paper, and across her hands, and across the shapes she was drawing. Shapes that were not random, that were not scrawl, that were a series of lines that intersected at precise angles, forming a pattern that no child would know, that had not been written down in any book Daniel owned, that had appeared in the margins of the parish register and the edges of the ledger and the dreams of priests who had gone before him. Her mother watched from the doorway, and when she saw the shapes, she crossed herself and whispered a prayer that had no words, only gestures, only the shape of hands rising and falling, the shape of a body asking for something it had no right to ask for, but asking anyway, because there was nothing else to do. Chapter 9. Daniel and Ambrose performed the rite on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays were ordinary days, and the entity preferred to work at night, and they had calculated, roughly, with the rough arithmetic of priests who had read too many chronicles and too few successes, that the 12th step would be completed at dawn, that the entity's patience had a limit that could be measured in light. In the slow advance of the sun across the floor of the room where Claire lay, in the particular quality of morning, silence that falls over the world when night has decided it is done. The Whitfields agreed to the interruption with the reluctance of people who had been given two choices, both of them terrible, and who had chosen the one that felt like it might have a door at the end of it, a door that opened onto something they could name, even if the thing behind the door was frightening. Margaret signed the paper Daniel brought, her hand shaking. Robert refused until Daniel looked him in the eye and said, "Your daughter is the 12th. The 13th is your son. We interrupt the 12th, or we watch the 13th happen. There is no third option." Claire lay on her bed in her flannel pajamas. The room was cold. The lamp had been replaced by 4 candles placed at the corners of the bed, their flames unblinking in the still air, as if the room were sealed, as if the oxygen had been reduced to a minimum, as if nothing in the house were breathing. Margaret and Robert stood in the doorway, their bodies rigid with the particular terror of parents who have been told that their child is a battlefield in a war no one can see, and who have been handed a sword and told to stand back. Ambrose arrived with a leather satchel. He was 86 years old. His hands shook, but his voice did not shake. He set the satchel on the floor and withdrew from it a book bound in leather that had once been read, a vial of oil, a strip of parchment, and a knife. The knife was small, ceremonial, its blade dull and old, the kind of blade that had been sharpened 100 times and was now worn down to the metal, as though the act of sharpening had removed more than the rust and the dullness, as though the steel itself had thinned with use, with age, with the slow erosion of a thing that had been used for what it was made for, and had come away thinner every time. It had been used, Ambrose said, in every rite since 1962, and perhaps before, in rites no one had recorded, in rites performed by men whose names were no longer spoken. The 12th step is nearly finished, Ambrose told Daniel in the hallway before they entered, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for 36 years and who had finally been given permission to have it. The entity has been speaking through her for 9 days. 9 days is the length of the novena. It knows the rhythm. It thinks it has learned the music. If we interrupt now, before dawn, It will not be able to complete the stanza, but it will know we are interfering. It will leave a message. Do not listen to it. Daniel nodded. He held the catechism. His hands were wet. The book threatened to slide from his grip. He wiped his palms on his cassock. He breathed in. He breathed out. He followed Ambrose into the room. They entered. The candles flared, once, as if acknowledging a new presence, as if the thing in the room had recognized the old man and the younger man standing in the doorway, as if it had been waiting for them, as if the interruption had been anticipated, as if the entire sequence had been designed to bring them to this moment, in this room, at this hour, speaking these words, with this knife, with this red book, with this candlelight. Claire did not struggle. She lay very still, her hands flat at her sides, and she watched them with the same patience she had shown Daniel, the same patient, ancient, terrible gray eyes. And when Ambrose stepped to the bedside, she spoke. Her voice was her own voice, and the entity's voice, and something in between, a harmony of two languages spoken simultaneously, the words of the rite and the words of the counter-rite colliding in the small room with a sound like tearing cloth, like the seam of a garment ripped open from the bottom up, like the sound of something being undone that had been sewn together with the care of centuries. The temperature dropped so quickly that the breath from Daniel's mouth froze in the air, a small white cloud that hung between them like a ghost. The candles bent toward the floor. The flame of the one on the left went out, and the flame on the right elongated, thin and blue, and then it too was gone. Ambrose did not hesitate. He opened the red book. He began to read aloud in a voice that was surprisingly strong, surprisingly steady, the voice of a man who had turned fear into discipline 50 years ago and had not stopped practicing since, who had memorized the words until they were a part of him, who had carried them in his throat and his chest and his hands, who had waited for this moment for as long as he had been alive. The Latin was precise. It was not the Latin of the liturgy. It was not the Latin of the classroom. It was the Latin of a rite designed to interrupt, to sever, to halt the flow of something that was not blood but was similar enough to blood to be dangerous, that pulsed, that moved, that carried memory and intention in the slow, patient accumulation of 200 years of debt. Claire did not struggle. She lay very still, breathing evenly, the way a person breathes when they are not the one speaking, when the voice is coming from elsewhere, from the back of the head, from the space behind the eyes, from the throat where two voices are sharing the same instrument, and one is being asked to stop before it has finished its song. When Ambrose reached the fifth stanza, she spoke. The voices collided again, louder this time, the young and the old, the borrowed and the borrower, the one that wanted to finish and the one that was being stopped. The walls of the room shivered. The plaster cracked in a place that was not near any door, near any window, near any ordinary stress point, the crack appearing as if from the pressure of the sound, as if the room itself were trying to contain something that was already too large for it. Then it stopped. The candles flickered and went out. The room was dark, though the lamp in the hallway continued to burn behind the Whitfields, and Daniel could see the shapes of the bed, of Margaret's shoulder, of Robert's head, bent forward in prayer he had not learned to pray. Claire drew a single, sharp breath. When she spoke again, the voice was her own, young and terrified, the voice of a girl who had been speaking another language and had suddenly remembered her own. "What happened?" she whispered. "I was somewhere else. I was in a field. There was a door. It was open. I was walking toward it." Daniel took her hand. It was warm, which made the cold in the room more disturbing, because it meant the cold was leaving her, because the thing that had been borrowing her warmth was gone, because the interruption had worked, had succeeded, had stopped the ritual mid-stanza, had closed the door that was already ajar, had pulled the latch without shutting the bolt. "You're back," he said. She blinked. She looked at Ambrose, at Daniel, at the candles on the floor, which had burn marks on the rugs beneath them, though no one had touched them. "How long was I gone?" she asked. 9 days, Daniel said. She tried to sit up. Her body was weak. Her head fell back against the pillow. She whispered. Something was waiting in the field. It was patient. It was going to come in when I finished the stanza. It said it was almost there. It said one more step, and it would be done. "What step?" Daniel asked. Before she could answer, she slid sideways, her head turning, her eyes closing, her breathing slowing, as if the answer had been too much, as if the exertion of speaking, of returning, of holding two voices in one throat for 9 days and then suddenly losing one of them, had exhausted her body in a way that sleep could not repair. Her hand went limp in his. He held it for a moment longer, then laid it gently on the duvet, beside the paper she had been drawing on, the door with the lines that intersected, the pattern that was not a pattern but an architecture, a stanza, a step in a sequence that had been interrupted but not finished. "She's in a coma," Robert said, his voice raw, his throat thick with the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for an hour and had just been allowed to exhale. "Not a coma," Daniel said, though he was not sure this was true. "A rest. Let her sleep." Margaret screamed. It was a small, sharp sound, and it echoed in the hallway, and the candle in the dining room flickered and went out, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw, in the corner of his eye, a shape in the shadows of the rafters, a form that had no right to be there, that was watching, that was patient, that was pleased, as if the interruption had been expected, as if the entity had allowed itself to be interrupted, as if it had been waiting for Daniel and Ambrose to perform the rite so that it could leave and leave behind a message and identify its next host. In the hallway, away from the room, the entity spoke one more time. It did not speak through Claire. It spoke through the air itself, through the dry plaster of the wall, through the old wood of the doorframe, through the nails and the screws and the slow, settling bones of the house, in a voice that was quiet and clear and unmistakable, a voice that Daniel recognized as his mother's, and as the Whitfield's dead, and as the voice of the priest who had written the note in 1962, and as the voice of every man who had ever stood in a room and watched something leave a body it had worn like a coat. 13 finishes it, the entity said. Daniel turned. He reached for the doorframe. It was cold under his hand. He made the sign of the cross. He said nothing else. He stood in the hallway with Ambrose, and they listened to the silence return, and they knew, both of them, that the entity had left a hole in the world where it had been, and the world was rushing in to fill it, and what filled it was not warmth, not light, not comfort, but the cold, the particular cold of a place where something had been and was no longer, the cold of a room that had been occupied and was now, suddenly, empty, and had not yet adjusted to the loss. Outside, in the leaf litter of the churchyard, a fox stood on its hind legs and looked at the house, and then it sat down, and it watched, and it waited. Claire did not wake that night. She did not wake the next day. At dusk, the doctor came, and he examined her, and he checked her pupils, and he listened to her heart with a stethoscope that reflected the candlelight, and he said, "She's in a coma. Medically. I don't know why, but she's not dead." Margaret sat by the bed and held her daughter's hand. Robert stood at the window, smoking, his back to the room, his body a silhouette against the glass, and he watched the church and the tree line and the road, and he thought about the message that had come through the wall, and the way the house had gone cold, and the way his wife had screamed, and the way the doctor had said he did not know, and he realized, with a slow and terrible certainty, that he had believed, for 3 weeks, in something he could not name, and that belief had been stronger than anything he had believed before, and that it had felt like love, and that it was not. Ambrose and Daniel stood in the hallway, and Ambrose lit a cigarette, and they smoked together in the corridor of a house that had gone cold again, colder than it had been before, because the entity had left a hole in the world when it departed, and the world was rushing in to fill the gap, and what filled it was older than the house, older than the family, older than the town, older than the rite. "It has identified its next host," Ambrose said. "We know," Daniel said. "We have to find it before the entity does." "We," Ambrose said. "Not I. I am too old for hunting." "Then teach me," Daniel said. "Teach me the rest of the rite. Teach me what I have to know to close the door." Ambrose looked at him. He exhaled smoke. The hallway was dark. The smoke drifted toward the ceiling and vanished, as if the house had decided it would not hold anything that belonged to the old man, as if the house were already belonging to the thing that had just passed. Chapter 10. Daniel returned to the parish on Thursday with Claire still unconscious in the Whitfield house. He went straight to the archive, carrying the red book and the list of names. He sat at the oak table under the single yellow bulb and read the founding ledger, because he was certain he had missed something. The entity was thorough. It had been thorough for 200 years. It had not chosen a 13th vessel at random. There had to be a pattern, and if he was patient enough, he would find it. He traced the list of the 12 families present at the founding. The names were familiar, not because he knew them personally, but because they were on street signs and buildings and headstones in the churchyard. The people who had stood in the pews and donated and been buried in soil they had walked on for generations. The Whitfields had remained. Claire was the 12th vessel. The ledger made no mention of a 13th, but Daniel knew, with the certainty that comes from reading too many stories and seeing the pattern repeated in the flesh, that a 13th person had been marked. He pulled out the laptop and opened the genealogical database. He entered Whitfield and traced the line backward from Robert, from Claire, into 1792, when Josiah Whitfield had stood in a field with his strip of cloth and his coin and his empty words. The line was clear, direct, uninterrupted by movement or migration, a chain that stretched to Robert, who had 2 children, Claire, born 2008, and Noah, born 2014, 5 years old, who played with trucks and animals and a set of crayons worn down to nubs, who did not yet know the entity had been waiting for him. Daniel stared at the screen. The bloodline was there. The debt was there. He underlined Noah Whitfield twice. He called Ambrose that evening and told him about the founding families, the bloodline, the pattern. Ambrose listened in silence, then asked, "Are the Whitfields the only family left?" The Crows moved away in 1952. The Abramses in 1989. The Harts are 4 generations removed. The entity chooses proximity. Direct line. Daniel thought of Noah's laugh, which Margaret had described as quiet, the way some children listen to music no one else can hear. He thought of the drawings, the yellow crayon doors. "We must move him," Daniel said, "to the church beneath the altar. The entity will try to complete the ritual here." Margaret called the next morning, her voice tight. He spoke for an hour, him and his sister, at the same time, from different rooms. Their voices were the same. Daniel dressed in 3 minutes. He drove to the house in the dark, carrying the red book, the vial of oil, the strip of parchment, and the dull knife. Noah sat on the living room floor surrounded by trucks and animals. He turned a page in a picture book and began drawing with a yellow crayon, head bent, concentration absolute. "Hi, Father Reyes," he said without looking. Daniel knelt. "What are you drawing?" Noah looked up. His eyes were gray, older than his face. "A door. The door my great-grandfather should have closed." Margaret reached for Noah's hand. Robert entered without being heard, hands in pockets. Joss said, having stopped drinking, "We need to move him to the church beneath the altar," Daniel said. Robert nodded. The church. They left at 10. The road was brown and slick. Daniel drove. Noah sat in the back with his mother, head against the window, hands tracing patterns on the glass. "I feel it," Noah whispered. "It is waiting for me to finish the drawing." The church was empty and cold. The stained glass showed the world in shades of blue and red, as though the day were older than it was. The altar stood beneath the crucifix. Ambrose arrived separately and waited by the side door. The Whitfields stood in the aisle. Noah beside his mother, calm. "Beneath the altar is a foundation stone from 1792, Daniel said, because the cold had told him. "The door is still there. We must go down, perform the closing rite. Someone must be the vessel, absorbing the final backlash." "I will go," Ambrose said. "The backlash will kill you. The entity will not accept a child. It will accept me. I have been the witness for 36 years. Now I will become the vessel. It is the only way to close the door." Daniel argued, speaking of age and cruelty, of the debt Claire could still pay, of the boy who could still live. But Ambrose's hand on his shoulder was iron. "You must go above. Stay with Noah. Tell them the story so they never forget. I have spent 36 years watching 12 vessels walk through doors. I am tired." Ambrose stepped to the altar and placed his hand on the stone. "The 13th vessel is present. The bloodline is here. Let us finish what we started in 1792. The wind outside picked up. The fox that had been watching ran for the woods and did not look back. Daniel went home and sat in his study with the genealogical printouts spread on the desk beside him. He traced the Whitfield line with his finger, following the crossings and recrossings, the marriages and migrations, the deaths and births and quiet, stubborn returns to the same soil, the same street, the same house where the porch sagged on the left and the garden had a fence that needed mending and a tree that had grown too large for the yard but had never been cut down, because the Whitfields did not cut trees. Because the trees were older than the family and older than the church and older than the town, and had watched the rite and had watched the rattle of the pipes and had watched the children grow and draw doors and speak languages they had never been taught. And the trees did not talk, but if they did, they would have stories to tell that would make the hairs on the back of a man's neck stand up. He thought of the historical society, of the journal sitting in its box, of the names that had been recorded and the names that had been left out, of the men who had written the records and the women who had kept them and the children who had lived them. He thought of the debt and the payment and the long, slow, patient timing of the universe, which did not hurry, which did not care, which simply did what it had always done, which was to wait for the right moment, the right vessel, the right priest, the right combination of courage and fear and willingness to stand in a basement and hold a body that had died for a truth the church preferred not to know, and to say, simply, this is what happened, and then to go on living with the knowledge, with the silence, with the weight of the story on his shoulders. Daniel called Margaret later that afternoon, after he had walked the church perimeter, after he had checked the lock on the basement door, after he had sat in the car and watched the road for a long time, watching for the fox, watching for the thing, watching for the smell of old stone and decay and something that was not quite alive and not quite dead, and had seen nothing but wind and leaves in the ordinary, exhausted world. He told her to keep the curtains drawn. He told her to keep the house warm. He told her to keep Noah away from the walls, because the walls were not safe. Not anymore. Not until the closing was complete. Not until the ritual was finished. Not until the door had been shut and sealed and the backlog of 200 years of silence was finally, at last, brought to an end. Margaret listened. She did not interrupt. She did not question. She simply said yes, and the yes was quiet, and it was careful, and it was the yes of a woman who had learned, in 3 weeks, that the world was not what it seemed, and that the people who loved her were not the only ones watching, and that love, in the end, was not enough, but it was all there was, so it would have to be enough. It would have to sustain her. It would have to carry her through the day and the night and the morning and the afternoon and the long, slow, interminable hours of waiting that stretched before her like a road with no end in sight, no destination, no relief, only the walking, only the keeping, only the holding of her son's hand and the watching of her daughter's breath and the prayer she said every night before bed, the prayer that had no words, only gestures, only the shape of hands rising and falling, only the shape of a mother asking the universe to spare her children, to take her instead, to let her be the vessel, to let her be the host, to let her be. The debt paid so that her children could be free. Daniel hung up. He sat in the dark. Outside, the churchyard was empty. The fox was gone. The tree scraped its branches together, and the sound was like whispering, like a voice calling out in a language he almost understood, and he closed his eyes and listened, and he tried to hear the words, and he could not, and he did not need to, because he already knew what they were saying. He had known for weeks. Since the day Margaret had sat in his office with her hands trembling and her eyes bright and her daughter's name on her lips and the smell of lavender in her hair and the cold in her heart, and he had said, I will come, and he had come, and he had stayed, and he had found the names, and he had read the ledger, and he had knelt beside a bed and held the hand of a girl who had been speaking languages she had never learned, and he had thought, this is not supernatural, this is not demonic, this is not evil in the way that evil wears horns and laughs and burns people. This is something older, something patient, something thorough, something that had been called into the world by people who meant well and had forgotten to send it away, and it had been waiting ever since, patient, thorough, inevitable, and now, finally, it was about to end, or it was about to begin again, and Daniel did not know which, and he sat in the dark, and he waited, and the fox was gone, and the church was silent, and the night was ordinary, and the world was ordinary, and everything was going to be all right, or it was not, and either way, he would stand, he would watch, he would not leave, he would finish what he had started, and the door, whatever happened, would be closed. Margaret whispered a prayer in the doorway, the prayer of a woman who had been taught to pray in church and in the car and at the bedside, who had prayed for her children and her husband and her garden and her house, and who now discovered that prayer was not a thing that guaranteed safety, that it was merely a thing that made the waiting bearable. Robert stood beside her, his fists clenched at his sides, and he did not pray, because he had stopped believing in prayers a long time ago. Or perhaps he had never believed in them, and the last 3 weeks had only confirmed what he had always suspected, that the world was a place where bad things happened and good people suffered, and there was no one listening. Or if there was someone listening, they were very far away and had more important things to attend to. Noah stood between them, his hand in his mother's, his other hand still holding the yellow crayon, and he was not afraid. He did not know enough to be afraid. He had been drawing doors all his life, in the margins of his picture books, on the walls of his room, on the sidewalk with chalk, and he did not know that doors could be dangerous, that doors could be traps, that doors could be the only way into a place you did not want to go. He looked at Ambrose, and he smiled, the way children smile at old men in churches, with the uncomplicated trust that comes from not having been hurt enough to know better. And Ambrose smiled back, and the smile was thin and sad, and so full of regret it made Daniel look away, because he knew what was coming. He knew what the smile meant. He knew that the old man had decided, in that moment, in the nave of the church, in front of the altar and the crucifix and the child who was the vessel and the parents who were the witnesses, that he would pay the debt, that he would close the door, that he would finish what he had started in 1987 and had refused, and that the refusal had come back to him now, in the form of a yellow crayon door and a boy with gray eyes and a voice that had not yet learned to speak, but would soon, and that the debt, like all debts, would be paid, like all debts, in the end. Chapter 11. Ambrose did not speak for the entire drive back to the retirement facility. He sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's car with his hands folded around his cane, his eyes on the road as though he were watching for something specific in the dark, something that did not belong to the road or the trees or the towns they were passing through, something that had been waiting by the side of the highway, patient and thorough, watching for the return of the man who had interrupted it once. The heater worked poorly. The windows fogged. When Daniel reached the facility, Ambrose did not move immediately. He sat for a long moment, looking at the brick building, at the lawn where the old men walked in circles, at the van that delivered groceries on Tuesdays and Fridays, at the tree that had been planted when the building opened, a tree that was now tall and knotted and bare, its branches spread against the sky like the arms of a man who had been crucified and was still waiting for the word that would tell him he could come down. "I have kept a secret," Ambrose said, finally. "For 36 years. Daniel turned off the engine. The silence that followed was complete, the kind that settles after a long sentence, when the speaker has decided that the words are more important than the reaction, that the telling is more significant than the cure, that the story will not be believed anyway. And that belief is not the point. The point is the saying of it, the putting of it down outside of the body where it has lived, where it has grown, where it has eaten the man from the inside out, until there was nothing left but the secret and the silence, and the boy who had been the vessel, and the brother who had been the vessel, and the priest who had been the witness, and the man who had been left behind to carry the weight of the knowledge." In 1987, Ambrose said, "The entity spoke to me." Daniel listened. The radiator in the car ticked as it cooled. Outside, a door slammed, and laughter rolled across the parking lot, raw and unfiltered, the sound of people who had forgotten, for a moment, that the world was not entirely kind, that the world had doors, that the world had things behind them that preferred to remain hidden. The laughter belonged to a nurse who had just finished her shift, who was smoking a cigarette and talking to the security guard about a television show no one else in the town watched, about a story that had nothing to do with anything real. "It was the night before I performed the rite on Peter," Ambrose said. "I was sitting in the rectory of the old church, the one that had been replaced by the current building in 1912, the one that stood on the hill before the hill was leveled and moved and rebuilt, the one whose stones were used to build the new basement, the stones that now held the archive, the stones that now held the room that had been sealed for 2 centuries and then opened, briefly, by a man who had found the list of names and had decided to act on them. I was reading the breviary. I had a glass of whiskey, and the entity spoke to me through the wall, through the plaster, through the old stone, in a voice that was not Latin and not English, but something older, something that sounded like the voice I had heard in confession 100 times, the voice of a man who had done something terrible and wanted to be forgiven, the voice of a boy who had stolen and could not ask his mother for mercy because he did not know if she would give it. What did it say? Ambrose closed his eyes. The street lamp outside caught the lines on his face, the wrinkles, the scars, the marks of time that had passed slowly and deliberately through a body that had once been strong, that had once carried the weight of this knowledge without bending, that had bent only when the weight became too much, when the brother was gone, when the entity was gone, when the silence was the only thing left to talk to. It offered me a choice. It said, I have been interrupted 11 times. I have been waiting 11 times already. I am tired of waiting. I am tired of using children. If you become the 12th vessel, not the 12th host, but the vessel at the site, the one who closes the door, you will end this. All of it. The hosts, the steps, the bloodline. You will lay down the debt that was taken from your brother, and from every Whitfield and Hart and Crow who has carried it since 1792. And you will not survive. But I will not destroy you. I will absorb you into the closing, and you will be part of the seal that holds. Daniel turned in his seat. He looked at Ambrose. The old man's face was composed, too composed, the face of a man who had rehearsed this confession in silence for 36 years, alone in the dark, saying the words to the wall where a man once sat with a glass of whiskey and a heart full of fear, saying the words to the wall where the entity had spoken, saying the words to the wall that had kept the secret so long it had become a part of the mortar, a part of the plaster, a part of the building itself, until someone had decided to tear it down, to build something new, to make the past disappear, which it never does, not really, not ever. And you said no. I said no. Ambrose's mouth twisted. I said no out of fear. I was 45 years old. I had my whole life ahead of me. I had a career. I had a woman I loved, who left me 6 months later because I could not stop thinking about what I had heard in the wall, because I had come home late and drunk and shaking and had told her, in the middle of the night, that the walls could speak, and she had believed me, at first, and then she had not, and then she had left, and she had taken the cat, and the cat had been the only living thing I had spoken to in weeks. I said no out of fear. I said no because I did not believe it was possible. I said no because I thought the church would save me, and the rite would save me, and God would save me. God did not save me. The rite saved my brother. It saved the next host. It saved the next host after that. It saved them all until now, when we have run out of hosts that the entity has not already used, when the 13th vessel is a child, when the debt has begun to compound. Daniel was quiet. He thought about the letter from the diocese, the delays, the quarterly meetings, the preference for silence over action. He thought about the open window in the church basement, the incomplete rite, the step that remained. He thought about Ambrose, who had been carrying this weight since 1987, longer than Daniel had been alive, and who had carried it alone, because the church does not want to know the things it has failed to do, because the church is a body that prefers the comfort of routine to the terror of truth, because the church has learned, over centuries, that some doors are better left unlatched, because to latch them is to acknowledge that they were ever open. Why are you telling me this now? Daniel asked. Because I cannot do it alone, Ambrose said. I am too old. I am too tired. The thing that spoke to me in 1987 will speak again, and it will not be as patient the second time, because it has learned that patience does not always work, that men grow old, that men die, that men can be fooled into thinking the pause is the end. And because you are the only person alive who knows the names. You are the only person who has read the ledger. You are the only person who has listened to the entity and not run away, who has not tried to explain it away, who has said, simply, this is, and this is real, and this must be answered. Daniel stood. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he turned. What must I do? He asked. Tell me what I must do. Ambrose smoked for a long time without answering. He watched the smoke drift toward the ceiling, watched it curl and drift, watched it vanish. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been, softer, as if the telling had exhausted him, as if the secret were heavier now that he had put it into words, as if the telling had made it real, had made it permanent, had made it something that could not be taken back, that could not be unsaid, that would now live in the world in the form of a story, and stories have a way of spreading, of growing, of being told to people who are not ready to hear them. Read, he said finally. Research the town's founding. The records are in the Historical Society, the ones the church does not keep. Learn what the settlers did. Learn what they tried to call, and what they called instead. Learn the counterword. Learn the final stanza. Until you understand the nature of the door, you cannot hope to close it. Daniel nodded. He left the room. He walked down the hallway of photographs and echoes to the parking lot. The sky was turning purple. The wind had picked up. The tree by the entrance scraped its branches together, and the sound was like whispering. Somewhere in the building behind him, a window slammed shut with a sound like a door closing on a room that should have been empty. That night, Daniel sat in his study with the parish register open and the Historical Society's contact information on his phone screen. He did not call. Instead, he opened the 1809 volume again, and he read Father Edmund Hale's entry. And he thought about the men who had been here before him, who had written the same words, who had stood in the same rooms and felt the same cold, and wondered, as he was wondering, whether the cold was a presence or merely an absence of warmth, and whether the absence of warmth was any less dangerous than the presence of cold. He fell asleep at the table. He dreamed of Latin. He dreamed of a voice he recognized but could not name. When he woke, his left hand was cramped around the rosary, and the beads were embedded in his palm. Chapter 12. Noah Whitfield began speaking Latin on a Thursday, 2 days after Daniel had left the yellow door drawing on the kitchen table, 2 days after saying 13th with the flat finality of a sentence that could not be unsaid. Margaret called Daniel at 8 in the morning, her voice hollow, as though panic had been exhausted and what remained was a structured terror that knew exactly what it was facing. He spoke for an hour, she said. Him and his sister. At the same time. From different rooms. Their voices were the same. Daniel dressed in 3 minutes, mismatched socks, unbuttoned collar, catechism in hand, and he drove to the house in the dark. The lane was empty. The house was dark except for one second-floor window that showed an orange glow. Robert opened the door, his face gray, the smell of whiskey on his breath. Margaret sat in the dining room, hands folded on her lap, staring at the table where the doctor had left a note no one had read. She looked exactly like a woman who had been holding her breath for weeks and had just been told she could exhale. Claire was upstairs in her room. On the monitor rigged from a baby monitor and a tape recorder, the sound of a girl breathing steady and slow, as though she were asleep somewhere else. On the hall table, the yellow door drawing still lay, untouched, because the Whitfields had not thrown it away, because throwing it away would have meant admitting it mattered, would have meant admitting that a door drawn by a 5-year-old boy in wax crayon could be more real than the front door of the house they had lived in for 5 years. Noah Whitfield sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by toy trucks and plastic animals. He was 5. He had his mother's eyes. He was drawing with a yellow crayon, head bent, concentration absolute. He turned a page in a picture book and began drawing on the other side, and the crayon moved with the same speed and precision as Claire's had, the way a craftsman's hand moves when it is building something it has built before and knows by heart. "Hi, Father Reyes," he said without looking. Daniel knelt. "What are you drawing?" Noah looked up. His eyes were gray, older than his face. "A door. The door in the stone. The door in the field. The door my great-grandfather should have closed. The door they left open." Daniel thought of Josiah Whitfield, whose mistake had been inherited as debt, whose coin and cloth had been offerings, whose empty words had become a summons he never meant to make. He thought of the ledger and the names and the blood that ran through the child's small, scrawny arms, blood that had been in the town before the church had been built, before the road had been paved, before the fox had been a fox instead of whatever had been here before the fox. Margaret reached for Noah's hand. Robert entered without being heard, hands in pockets, jaw set, having stopped drinking during the hours of waiting that had turned the house inside out and the family into the shy and careful strangers they had become to each other. "We need to move him to the church beneath the altar," Daniel said. "The entity will try to complete the ritual here." Robert nodded. The church. They left at 10. It was a pale, cloudy morning. The leaves had all fallen. The road was brown and slick. The maples stood bare, their branches black against the sky. Daniel drove. Noah sat in the back with his mother, head against the window, eyes closed, and his hands were moving, tracing patterns on the glass, on the upholstery, on the air itself, as if he were drawing the door he had drawn on paper, but drawing it everywhere now, on the car, on the world, on the reality they were passing through, until the world itself became the room, became the vessel, became the architecture of a ritual that had been building toward this moment, this child, this drive, this door. I feel it, Noah whispered, without opening his eyes. It is waiting for me to finish the drawing. The church was empty and cold. The stained glass showed the world in shades of blue and red, as though the day were older than it was, as though the light had been filtered through something thick, something dark, something that had been waiting for the sun to set. The altar stood at the far end, beneath the crucifix. The candles were lit. Ambrose arrived separately and waited by the side door. The Whitfields stood in the aisle, Noah beside his mother, calm, while the cold in the room rose around them like a tide, slow and inevitable, as if the church itself were breathing, as if the stone were alive, as if the foundation were a body opening its mouth to speak. Daniel stopped at the edge of the sanctuary. He did not need to ask. He knew the door was beneath the altar, in the way he knew the sun would rise, in the way he knew the river would flow, in the way he knew some doors were built into the architecture of the world. Beneath the altar is a foundation stone from 1792, he said, because the cold had told him. The door is still there. The entity is waiting there. We must go down, perform the closing rite. Someone must be the vessel, absorbing the final backlash. I will go, Ambrose said. The backlash will kill you. The entity will not accept a child. It will accept me. I have been the witness for 36 years. Now I will become the vessel. It is the only way to close the door. Daniel tried to argue. He spoke of age and cruelty, of the debt Claire could still pay, of the boy who could still live. But Ambrose's hand on his shoulder was iron. You must go above. Stay with Noah. Tell them the story so they never forget. I have spent 36 years watching 12 vessels walk through doors. I am tired. Ambrose stepped to the altar and placed his hand on the stone. The 13th vessel is present. The bloodline is here. The hour is late. Let us finish what we started in 1792. The wind outside picked up. Leaves skittered across the churchyard. The fox that had been watching all week ran for the woods, silent, deliberate, and it did not stop until it reached the tree line, where it sat and watched. In the nave above, Margaret's voice rose in a sharp sound. Robert shouted something Daniel could not hear, because the room was full of wind, wind that came from the stone, from the earth itself opening briefly and then closing, as a mouth closes when the last word is said. Margaret crossed herself and whispered a prayer that had no words, only gestures, only the shape of hands rising and falling, the shape of a body asking for something it had no right to ask for, but asking anyway, because there was nothing else to do. Robert stood with his hand on Noah's shoulder, his fingers digging in, and he did not cry, because grief had been replaced by something harder, something younger, something that looked like hope and sounded like fear and felt like the beginning of a long road that no one had taught him how to walk. Daniel went to the basement. He unlocked the trapdoor. He lowered himself down the ladder into the stone chamber, and the cold that greeted him was older than the church, older than the town, older than the men who had built it, and it rose from the foundation stone like heat from a furnace, like breath from a mouth that had been closed for 230 years. Ambrose was already there, standing beside the stone, his hand pressed to its surface, his eyes closed, his face lit by the lantern Daniel had brought, and his face was calm, the face of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 36 years, who had rehearsed it in his memory, who had known all along that the rite required a vessel, and that the vessel would be him, and that the price would be his life, and that the price was the only thing that had ever been fair about the whole terrible, patient, inevitable sequence. Daniel placed the red book on the altar. He opened it to the closing rite. He read the first stanza aloud, and the words were cold, and the stone was cold, and the air was cold, and the only warmth in the room came from Ambrose's hand, still pressed to the stone, and from Noah, somewhere above, breathing in the nave, and from Claire, somewhere in the house, breathing in a room that was no longer cold because the entity had left it, because the entity was here now, in the basement, in the chamber, in the room beneath the altar where the air moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of something that was waiting to be closed, waiting to be finished, waiting to be paid. Ambrose opened his eyes. He looked at Daniel. He smiled, one last time, a smile that was not thin this time, not dry, but full, and sad, and grateful, the smile of a man who had carried a weight for a lifetime and had finally been allowed, by a younger man and a child and the careful, patient, unyielding work of the universe, to set it down. Go, Ambrose said. Tell them the story. And when the closing is done, come back. I will be here." Daniel climbed the ladder. He emerged into the nave. The Whitfields were waiting. Margaret held Noah's hand. Robert stood with his back to the altar, watching the door that was no longer there. Daniel crossed himself. He spoke the words they needed to hear, the words that were not lies, the words that were the truth without the whole truth, the words that would let them live with the knowledge that their son was safe and their daughter would wake, and that the door was closed, and that the priest who had died in the basement had died for something, even if they did not yet understand what. Margaret nodded. Robert nodded once, sharply, as though acknowledging a debt he would spend the rest of his life paying. Noah looked at the stairs that led down to the basement, and he smiled, the way children smile when they know a secret the adults do not. And he said, "The door is closed." And his mother shivered, because she did not know how he knew, because he was 5, because he was her son, because the world was still full of doors, and some of them were still open, and some of them were still waiting. Daniel went back down. He found Ambrose standing where he had left him, hands still on the stone, eyes closed, face calm, as though he were praying, or as though he were listening to a voice that no one else could hear, the voice of a man who had done what he came to do and was now ready to be done. And Daniel knew, without asking, that he should not speak, should not interrupt, should not say goodbye, because goodbye was for people who were leaving, and Ambrose was not leaving. He was staying, he was remaining, he was becoming the seal itself, the final stanza, the closing word, the end of the sequence and the beginning of the silence. And Daniel stood beside him for a long time, and then he climbed the ladder again, and he locked the door, and he walked out of the church, and he did not look back. Chapter 13. The trapdoor was beneath the altar, as Ambrose had known it would be, though he had never seen it, had only read of it in the thin volumes of diocesan history that mentioned the first church in passing, before hurrying on to the consecration of the second building. The stone slab was heavy, black with age, and it fit so precisely into the frame that Daniel thought, briefly, it had been designed to be moved, that the men who had built the church in 1792 had known, even then, that the door might need to be opened again. He pried it up with the crowbar Ambrose had brought. The metal rang against the stone. The sound echoed in the empty nave, and Robert Whitfield flinched, and Margaret held Noah tighter, and the candles on the altar flared, once, as if something below had breathed. Ambrose knelt beside the opening. He leaned in. He listened. He came back with dust on his cassock and a look on his face that Daniel had not seen before, a look of quiet recognition, as though the darkness below had spoken to him, and as though he had understood. "It is there," Ambrose said. "The site, the stone where the rite was performed. It is intact. How do you know?" "Because the cold is not from the air. It is from the stone. It is the cold of a room that has been closed for 230 years. The cold of a thing that has been waiting." They lowered a ladder into the opening. The wood creaked. Daniel went first, because he was the priest, because the rite was his to complete, because he had been carrying the red book since he left the rectory that morning, and the weight of it in his hands felt like the weight of an argument he had not yet won. The room below was small. It was lined with stone, dressed and fitted with a precision that the records did not attribute to the men of 1792, who had built the church with timber and labor and little else. The walls were smooth. The floor was flagstone. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, or what was left of it, a slab of granite, much like the one on which the current church was built, and upon which the current altar stood 2 centuries later. The room smelled of damp and time. The air was so cold Daniel's breath came in clouds. He held the red book in one hand and the lantern he had brought in the other, and the light pushed back the dark only a few feet, and beyond that the darkness was complete, and he thought, briefly, that he could see movement in it, shapes that were not shadows, forms that were watching. He climbed the rest of the way down. Ambrose followed. The Whitfields remained above, with Noah between them, and Daniel heard the whisper of their voices, Margaret's soft, Robert's low and rough, the sound of a family talking to a child who was not entirely a child, who was carrying something that had been waiting to be said for centuries. "The foundation stone," Daniel said, turning in the narrow room. "Where is it?" Ambrose stepped toward the back wall. He knelt. He brushed away a layer of dust and debris, and there, beneath the grime of 2 centuries, was a carving, a series of concentric circles, intersecting lines, a symbol that Daniel recognized from the ledger, from the drawings Claire had made, from the yellow door Noah had drawn in crayon. The original rite was performed upon this stone, Ambrose said. The 12th step was completed on this stone. The 13th step will be completed here if we do not close the door. The entity is waiting below. It is waiting in the space between the layers of stone. It has been here the whole time, patient, watching, letting us believe it moved from host to host, when in fact the hosts were only the vessels it used to prepare the words that would complete the circuit. Daniel knelt beside Ambrose. He placed his hand on the stone. It was cold, colder than the air, colder than anything he had ever touched, as though the stone had absorbed a temperature that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the absence of light and life. "We must close the door from this side," Daniel said, "with the vessel present." "The vessel is Noah," Ambrose said. No, Daniel's voice was firm. "Noah is the 13th host. The entity wants him for the final step. If we place him as the vessel, the entity will possess him and complete the ritual, and we will have achieved nothing but a delay. We need someone else, someone willing, someone who will stand here and invite the entity's focus, so that when the door closes, the entity is trapped here with that person and it cannot escape to find another host." Ambrose was silent. He ran his hand over the carved stone, over the circles and lines and the precise geometry of a rite that had been designed to keep people safe and had done the opposite, that had called something in and then locked it in place and left it there to wait, patient, thorough, inevitable. "I told you," Ambrose said quietly. "In 1987, I told you the choice might fall to me. It has fallen. I will be the vessel." Daniel tried to argue. His words were reasonable. They spoke of the danger, of Ambrose's age, of the weakness of his body, of the cruelty of asking a man who had already been a priest for 50 years to lay down his life in a basement for the second time. But Ambrose shook his head. He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder, and the grip was strong, and the eyes were clear, and there was no fear in them, only a weariness so deep it had become peace. "I have spent 36 years watching," he said. "I have watched 12 vessels walk through this door. I have watched them wake with blank spaces in their memories. I have watched the entity move on. I have watched the church do nothing. I am tired. Let me finish it." Daniel looked at the stone. He looked at the symbols carved into it. He looked at the darkness beyond the circle of lantern light. And in that darkness he thought he saw, briefly, a shape, tall and thin and patient, watching them with the same calm it had brought to Claire's room, to the Whitfield house, to the open window in the church basement. "The rite requires a counterword," Daniel said. "The original rite had a final stanza that was missing. We need the word that closes the door. The word the founders should have spoken in 1792. We do not have the word," Ambrose said. "But we have something else. We have intent. We have the bloodline. We have the 13th vessel present in the church above. We have a man who is willing to close the door. The ritual is older than the word. It will recognize the sacrifice." Daniel closed his eyes. He thought of Claire. He thought of Noah. He thought of Margaret and Robert, holding their son in the church above, waiting for their daughter to wake. He thought of the cold and the dark and the thing that had been waiting in that dark for 200 years, patient and thorough and inevitable. And he understood, finally, that the entity was not evil in the way that evil is usually understood. It was justice. It was a debt. It was something that had been owed, and was owed, and would continue to be owed until someone paid it. "Then let us begin," he said. Ambrose stepped to the stone altar. He placed the red book upon it. He opened it to the rite of closure. He lit the candles that Daniel had brought, 4 of them, placed at the corners, their flames unblinking in the still, cold air. He poured the oil into a small dish. He placed it on the altar. Daniel stood beside him. He held the parchment strip. He had written the names of the 12 vessels on it, the names from the ledger, the names of the hosts who had carried the entity one step at a time across 2 centuries. He held the names up to the light. He read them aloud. "In the name of Mary Whitfield, who spoke Latin in 1809, we close the door." The room grew colder. The candles bent toward the floor. "In the name of Elizabeth Hart, who spoke Greek in 1823, we close the door." The stone beneath their feet vibrated. A sound came from the darkness, low and prolonged, the sound of a bell struck underwater, the sound of something large and old turning in its sleep. In the name of Thomas Crow, Clara Abram, William Phelps, Sarah Whitfield, George Hart, Ruth Phelps, Peter Ambrose, and the others whose names are not written, we close the door. Ambrose stepped forward. He placed his hand on the stone. He closed his eyes. I am the vessel, he said. I accept the focus. I closed the door. The darkness in the room moved. A shape formed, tall and thin, and the voice came from the walls and the floor and the stone. The voice that was Latin and English and the language of men who had died before the church was built. And it said, with the calm pleasure of a creature that had been waiting and was finally being acknowledged. 13. Daniel raised the parchment. He held it over the stone. He spoke the final stanza of the rite, the words that had been missing since 1792, the words that had been written on parchment and lost, and carried in voices and interrupted, and now, finally, spoken aloud, in a room that had been waiting for them as long as it had been waiting for the entity. The stone glowed, not with light, with heat, a heat so sudden and so intense that Daniel pulled his hand back, and the parchment caught fire, and the flames did not burn him, but lifted and drifted upward and dissipated into the ceiling, as though they were not fire but information, as though the words had been released, at last, after 200 years of imprisonment. The entity did not scream. It did not struggle. It simply entered Ambrose, the way water enters a cup, the way a door closes when the wind changes, and Ambrose made a sound, a single, sharp intake of breath, and his eyes opened wide, and they were gray, and he spoke, in his own voice, clear and strong. Close it. Daniel leaned forward. He pressed his hand to the stone. He had no words left. He had no parchment left. He had only the oil and the red book and the intention, which was older than the words, which was the original language of the rite, the language of men who had built churches and called things in and then forgot what they had done. He pressed the oil to the stone. He whispered the names. He felt the heat rise through his palm, up his arm, into his chest, and he knew, with a certainty that was not fear, that the door was closing, that the circuit was completing, that the debt was being paid. Above them, Noah Whitfield cried out. Margaret's voice rose in a sharp, broken sound. Robert shouted something Daniel could not hear, because the room was full of wind, wind that did not come from anywhere, wind that came from the stone, from the earth itself opening briefly, and then closing, as a mouth closes when the last word is said. Daniel held Ambrose's hand. The old man's grip was iron. His eyes were open. They were his own, and they were not his own, and they were gray, and they were tired, and they were the eyes of a man who had finally been allowed to rest. It is done, Ambrose said. The heat stopped. The candles went out. The room was dark, then lit again by the lantern that Daniel had set on the floor, its flame unblinking, the only thing in the room that had not changed. They climbed the ladder back into the nave. The Whitfields stood where they had left them. Noah was in Margaret's arms. He was asleep. His breathing was steady. Claire was still unconscious in the house. But the cold had gone from her room, the way the cold goes from a room when the sun has risen, the way a fever breaks when the body has finally decided to heal. Daniel looked at the altar. He looked at the trapdoor, closed now, flush with the stone, the seam invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. He looked at Ambrose, who leaned on his cane and breathed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who has finished a long journey. What now? Robert asked. Now, Daniel said, we wait. Chapter 14. Ambrose died on a Thursday. In the basement of the church, in the room beneath the altar, in the stone chamber that had been sealed for 230 years and reopened only long enough for a debt to be paid. And his death was quiet, and it was ordinary, in the way that all deaths are ordinary when they are observed by people who have been waiting for them, who have known they were coming, who have seen the body of the man who has been carrying a weight for 36 years lay down. The weight and step out of the world the way a man steps out of a coat he has worn too long in the cold. Daniel had tried to stop him. He had argued. He had pleaded. He had said the things that priests say when they watch other priests choose to die, the things that are meant to be persuasive but are mostly gestures, because by the time the choice has been made, the decision is old, older than the argument, older than the right, older than the debt, older than the man who is making it. He had said that there was another way, that the rite could be performed without a vessel, that the sacrifice was not necessary, that the entity could be sealed without a body to absorb the backlash, and Ambrose had simply looked at him with the weary, patient expression of a man who had seen the argument before, who had made the argument himself 36 years ago, in a room that was no longer standing, in a house that no longer existed, in a night that had passed into history, and who had decided, then and now, that the argument was wrong, that the rite required a vessel, that the ritual was not a spell but a structure, and a structure needs a weight to hold it in place when the door closes, a weight that is human, a weight that is willing, a weight that belongs to someone who knows the cost and is prepared to pay it. The entity is sealed, Daniel said, his voice shaking. We have closed the door. You don't have to stay. Ambrose looked at him with the calm of a man who has carried a secret for 36 years and has finally been allowed to set it down. The entity is not sealed yet, he said. The closing requires a vessel to absorb the backlash. That is me. It has always been me. I just needed to be brave enough to admit it. Peter could have lived, Daniel said. If you had done this in 1987, Peter would have lived, Ambrose agreed. But there would have been no end. The door would have been closed, but the debt would have remained. This is the way the rite works. It requires a sacrifice equal to the call. The call was made in 1792. The sacrifice must be made now. The debt must be paid in the currency it was borrowed in. Blood. Willing blood. My blood. Daniel reached for him. He tried to pull him back from the stone, from the edge of the altar, from the brink of the thing he had chosen. Ambrose gently removed Daniel's hand, the way a parent removes a child's hand from something hot, or from something holy, with a tenderness that contains the whole history of the relationship, the whole weight of the mentorship, the whole cost of the knowing. You must go, he said gently, and his voice was not the voice of a man commanding a subordinate, but of a man releasing a friend, of a man who had been lonely for a long time and had found, in Daniel, someone who understood, someone who had read the names, who had seen the pattern, who had not run away, who had stood in the room and faced the dark and asked it what it wanted. You must stay with Noah. You must stay with Claire. You must tell them what happened. You must tell them the story so that they never forget and never deny and never allow the door to be opened again. I will not leave you. Ambrose smiled. It was a thin, dry smile, and it did not reach his eyes, because his eyes were already far away, watching something Daniel could not see, something that was not the stone chamber, not the church, not the town, but the place where the entity had gone when the door closed, the place where debts are kept until they are paid in full, the place where the unfinished ritual lay, complete at last, its stanza finished, its circuit closed, its debt discharged. You will leave, he said. The voice was his own, but it carried the resonance of the entity now, the tone that had spoken through Claire, through the walls, through the air and the stone and the cold of the church basement, the voice that had been patient, that had been thorough, that had been waiting. Because the rite is complete, and I am the vessel, and the door is closed, and you have work left to do above. Daniel felt the heat rise again, not from the stone but from Ambrose's hand, from his chest, from his face, the heat of a body that was willing itself into the work, that was opening itself to the backlash, that was saying yes to something that had been offered to him in 1987 and that he had refused, that he had regretted, that he had spent 36 years thinking about, in the way a man thinks about the road he did not take, the woman he did not marry, the child he did not have, the sacrifice he did not make. The entity was leaving him. It was pouring out of him, the way water pours from a cup, the way a lamp burns out when the oil is gone, the way a door closes when the last person has passed through it. And the heat was the energy of the leaving, the momentum of 200 years finally coming to rest, finally dissolving, finally being swept away in the current of a ritual that had been designed to sweep it away. Daniel staggered. He put his hand on the altar to steady himself. The red book slid off the stone and hit the floor with a thud, and the sound was loud in the small room, louder than it should have been, because the room had gone still, because the air had gone out of it, because something was leaving and its departure was a kind of violence, a kind of storm, a kind of ending that was loud and sharp and undeniable, and Daniel stood in it, and he held on, and he watched. Ambrose did not stagger. He stood very still. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling, or through it, at the nave above, at the people who stood around the trapdoor and waited and did not know that the thing they had been afraid of had silently, calmly, accepted the bargain it had offered in 1987, and that the price had been paid in full. Claire, he whispered. It was a name. It was a word. It was a prayer. It was a farewell. He did not say anything else. Daniel held him. He held the body of a man who had been his friend for 3 weeks, who had been the keeper of a secret for 36 years, who had been the vessel for a debt that had been accumulating since before he was born, who had chosen, in the end, to pay it with his own body, his own breath, his own life. He held him as the heat faded, as the cold returned, as the lantern burned and the ladder stood and the silence settled, absolute and complete, like a seal. He held him while the candle guttered and went out. He held him while the dark came back, because the dark was always there. It had always been there. It would always be there. And the only difference between this dark and the dark before was that the heat had left it, that the entity had left it, that the debt had been paid and the wait was over. He did not cry. He did not pray. He simply stood, and he held the body, and he listened to the breathing stop, and he felt the last of the warmth leave the hand that had held his own, and when he was certain that the hand was no longer warm, he let go. He closed Ambrose's eyes. He crossed the old man's hands over his chest, the way you cross the hands of a man who has served the church, who has carried the weight of the divine, who has stood in the dark and said the words when no one was listening. He took the red book from the floor and placed it on the altar, as though it were a missal in a church that had never closed, in a church that had been open for 2 centuries, in a church that had needed this ending, this sacrifice, this quiet, ordinary, uncelebrated choice of one man to do what no one else would do, to pay what no one else would pay, to stand where no one else would stand, and to hold the door closed while the rest of the world went on with its ordinary business, its ordinary days, its ordinary deaths. He climbed the ladder back into the nave. The Whitfields were still there. Noah slept in Margaret's arms. Robert stood with his hand on the trapdoor, as though he knew, without knowing, that something had ended, that something had been sealed, that the house they had been living in for 3 weeks was no longer the same house, that the air they had been breathing was no longer the same air, that the silence that had fallen over the town was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of a thing that had passed through and left a space behind it, a space that was empty and clean and at peace. Daniel said nothing. He crossed himself. He looked at the closed trapdoor, at the seamless stone, at the place where the door had been and would never be again, and he felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest, the weight of the choice, the weight of the debt, the weight of the silence that would follow. Above them, the morning light had begun to break through the stained glass. The colors fell on the floor in long, slow rectangles. Chapter 15. Daniel remained in the nave for a long time after the Whitfields had left, after Noah had been carried out, after Robert had paused at the door and looked back at the trapdoor with an expression Daniel could not read, an expression that was not grief and not relief, but a story that was still being written, a face that had been shaped by the last 30 years and would be shaped by the next 30 years by something it could not name, by a debt it had inherited without consent, by a silence that had broken it and healed it and broken it again. Margaret had crossed herself and whispered a thank you that had no words left to attach to it, and her voice had cracked, and she had turned, and she had walked out with her son in her arms, and she had not looked back, because looking back would have meant acknowledging that the thing she had feared was real, and she had already accepted that, and she did not need to look at it again. The church was empty. The air was still cold, though it was mid-morning, and the sun was up, and through the stained glass the world was returning to its ordinary colors of green and brown and gray, the colors of a day that had decided to continue, that had decided the story was over, that had decided to go on. He went back to the basement. Ambrose's body was where he had left it. The red book was on the altar. The lantern had burned out. Daniel relit it from the taper he had brought in his pocket. The flame flared. The shadows lifted, or seemed to lift, though the room was still dark, still heavy with the smell of stone and time, still carrying the kind of silence that belongs to spaces that have been sealed for a long time, that have learned to hold their breath. He stood beside the body for a long time. He thought about what to do. He thought about the protocol for a priest who died in the performance of his duties, or in the performance of something like his duties, something that did not fit in the manuals, that did not have a form, that was not in the missal, that the church had not prepared for, that the church would not know how to handle, that the church would, perhaps, prefer to handle by ignoring it, by consigning it to the same silence it had kept for 2 centuries, by burying the truth along with the body, and moving on. He did not move the body. He did not touch the red book. He climbed the ladder, and he locked the trapdoor, not because anyone would find it, not because anyone would try to open it, but because it felt like the proper ending, the way a story ends when the final page has been turned, and the reader closes the cover, and the book goes back on the shelf, and the words inside are quiet again, and they do not move, and they do not breathe, and they wait, patient, thorough, for another reader, another priest, another moment when the door might be opened. Again, he drove to the chancery. He told the bishop what had happened. He told the story in full, without embellishment, without excuse, without the language of the occult, simply the account of a series of events that could have been documented if anyone had been watching, if anyone had been keeping records, if anyone had cared enough to look. The calls, the visits, the notes, the books, the names, the basement, the body, the light, the closing, the silence that followed. The bishop listened. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his expression unchanged, his face the face of a man who had heard many stories, many implausible stories, many stories that belonged in novels rather than in reports, and who had long ago decided that the truth was less important than the stability of the institutions that employed him, that the church was a body, and bodies preferred not to think about the things they could not explain, because explanation led to questions, and questions led to change, and change led to dissolution, and dissolution was the one thing the church feared more than anything it might have to face in the dark. Father Ambrose died in the performance of his duties, the bishop said, finally, his voice flat, uninflected, the voice of a man reading from a script he had not written but had carried for so long that it had become his own. The church will provide a funeral. You will provide the transcript of his last days. You will not mention the basement. You will not mention the entity. You will not mention the 13 steps. You will frame this as an act of pastoral care. You will say that Father Ambrose passed away peacefully in his sleep. You will not speak of sacrifices. Daniel looked at the bishop. He saw the fear in the man's eyes, not fear of the entity, but fear of exposure, fear of the story, fear of what would happen if the people of the diocese discovered that the thing that had been patient for centuries had been interrupted by a will stronger than their own, by a sacrifice they would never have authorized, by a man who had done what they were too cowardly to do, who had closed a door they preferred to leave ajar. Because doors left ajar are comfortable, doors left ajar do not. Force us to look at the dark beyond them, and the dark, when acknowledged, must be named, and named, it must be faced, and faced, it must be answered, and answered. The church would have to change, and the bishop would have to admit that he had been wrong, and the wrongness was not something he was prepared to wear. I will not lie, Daniel said, and his voice was steady, and it was the voice of a man who had stood in a basement and watched a friend die for a truth the church had preferred not to know, and who had decided, in the moment the hands had gone still, that he would carry the truth, that he would speak it, that he would not allow it to be buried with the body, not because the body did not deserve peace, but because the truth deserved a witness, and the witness was him. The bishop's jaw tightened. You will obfuscate, he said, and the word was sharp, like a hammer hitting a nail. There is a difference. You may omit. You may not lie. The church does not require lies. It requires discretion. Discretion is a word for lying, Daniel said. I will not omit it. He stood. He walked out of the office. He did not look back. He drove to the church. He went into the basement. He sat beside Ambrose's body until the light failed, until the lantern dimmed, until the darkness of the room became absolute, and he sat in it, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and he did not pray, because prayer felt inadequate, and silence felt like the only honest thing left, and in the silence he could hear, if he listened closely, the sound of the stone breathing, the sound of the door breathing, the sound of the debt being paid, the sound of the ritual completing itself in the dark, the sound of a man's life ending so that a child's could begin. He left at dusk, at the hour when the churchyard was darkest, when the crosses looked the same as the trees, when the sky was the color of the stone he had left behind. He left the body where it lay. He left the red book on the altar. He left the trapdoor closed. He locked the basement door. He went home. He sat at his desk. He opened the parish register. He opened the ledger. He wrote a single line in the margin of the 1962 entry, the one that had been written by the priest who had succeeded Ambrose's predecessor, the one that read, "Interrupted the rite. Host recovered. The thing did not leave. It merely stopped. He added, 1987. Amboise intervened. 12th step interrupted. 13th vessel identified. Closing performed by Amboise at the site. Entity sealed. He did not add that Ambrose was dead. He did not add that Claire was in a coma. He did not add that Noah was 5 years old and had drawn a door on a sheet of yellow paper. He did not add that the fox had sat at the foot of the crucifix that morning and had looked up at the empty cross as though it were waiting for someone who would never come. He closed the book. He placed it back on the shelf. He locked the archive. That night, he visited the Whitfields. Claire was still unconscious, but the monitor showed a steady rhythm. The coma-like state was stable. The doctor had no explanation. Margaret sat by the bed, and Robert stood at the window, and Noah was asleep in his own room, or appeared to be, though his crayon and his paper were on the table beside him, and the drawing was of a door, yellow and precise and slightly different from the one he had drawn before, as though the entity had completed its work, and the door was no longer a door in waiting but the door that had already been closed, the door that had been shut with the body of a man who had chosen to lie in the dark, so that the child could live in the light. Claire is the pause, Daniel said to Robert, to Margaret, to the room, to the bed where the girl lay with her face pale and her hands still. Noah is the 13th. The entity has marked him. It has chosen him because of his bloodline, because he is the direct descendant of the man who spoke the empty words in 1792. It needs him to finish the rite, but we have closed the site. He is safe. The entity cannot reach him there. Margaret whispered, Ambrose. Ambrose paid the debt, Daniel said. The entity was sealed with his sacrifice. The backlash was absorbed by him. He is gone. The door is closed. Noah will not speak Latin again. Claire will wake when the coma ends, and she will remember nothing. The entity will not return. The 13th step will not be completed. The 13th vessel will live an ordinary life, and he will forget the words, and the door will remain closed. Margaret crossed herself. She reached across the bed and took Daniel's hand. Her fingers were cold. Her touch was light. We cannot repay him, she said. Father Ambrose. You repay him by living, Daniel said. By not forgetting. By remembering that the church has a secret, and that the secret is yours now, and that you must keep it, so that no one else opens the door, so that no one else tries to call the guardian, so that no one else leaves the final stanza out of the rite, so that no one else grows up with a debt they did not contract, and do not know they are paying. Robert turned from the window. His face was harder, leaner, as though the last 10 days had stripped away everything soft and uncertain, and had left only the bones of a man who had learned that the world is not safe, and that priests are not magicians, and that doors can be closed, but only at a cost, and the cost was the life of a man who had been carrying the weight of the debt for half a century, and who had put it down, finally, in a basement, on a stone altar, in a room that would not be opened again. Will we ever hear from the diocese? Robert asked. I don't know, Daniel said, but it does not matter. What matters is Claire. What matters is Noah. What matters is the story. He left the house at 9. He drove home through the cold. The roads were empty. The stars were out. The fox was somewhere in the trees, watching. It did not follow the car. It stayed where it was, on the church wall, watching the closed window, watching the sealed door, watching the dark that had lost its heat, watching the silence that was no longer waiting for anything. He did not sleep. He sat at his desk and watched the street lamp outside his window burn with a steady, ordinary light. He thought about the basement of the church, about the stone chamber, about the body of a priest who had been carried for 2 centuries across 12 vessels and had finally, at the end of it all, been allowed to rest. He thought about the debt. He thought about the price of courage. He thought about the way evil is often just a story people have agreed not to tell each other, until someone is brave enough to read it aloud, until someone is brave enough to write it down, until someone is brave enough to stand in a basement and hold a body that has died for the truth, and to say, simply, this is what happened, this is what was done, this is the end. Chapter 16. Claire woke on Friday with the ordinary confusion of a 16-year-old who has been asleep for an indeterminate period and has no memory of why. The hospital room was white and smelled of disinfectant and the particular sweetness of flowers people bring when they think a loved one is lost and then found. Margaret was in a chair by the window, her head resting on her arms, her breathing slow and peaceful, the breathing of someone who has finally been allowed to stop holding herself together. Robert was there too, asleep in a second chair, his mouth open slightly, his hand on the arm of the chair where he had spent so many nights waiting for news that never came. Claire blinked. She looked at the ceiling. She moved her hand. It was heavy. It was her hand. She had a scar on her left knuckle from falling off her bicycle when she was 10. The scar was there. The hand was hers. The room was a hospital room. "Mom," she said. Margaret woke with a start. She sat up. She reached for Claire's hand. She held it. She did not say anything for a long time. She simply held the hand, and she cried. And Claire lay very still, because she did not understand what was happening, because the last thing she remembered was her math test, and then a headache, and then a blankness so total it felt like the blankness at the bottom of a dream, the place where the colors fade and the shapes dissolve, and there is nothing left but sleep. "You had a fever," Margaret said finally. "A bad fever. You were very sick." "How long?" 2 weeks. Claire tried to sit up. Her body was weak, but not as weak as it should have been after 2 weeks in a bed. She felt as though she had been resting, the way you rest after a long race, the way you rest after a long piece of music, the way you rest when you know the work is done. "What happened?" she asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked at Robert, who was awake now, watching them with the same careful attention he had given to every hour of the last 10 days. Robert shook his head, almost imperceptibly. He did not want her to know. He wanted the fever to be the end of the story. "You were very sick," Margaret said again. "But you are better now, and you are going home." Claire did not push. She lay back against the pillows. She thought about the dream, the way you think about dreams in the morning, before the day fully arrives, when the shapes are still soft and the edges are blurred, and you cannot tell whether you were doing something or watching something done. There had been a room. There had been a stone. There had been voices, many voices, speaking words she did not understand, and her voice was one of them. And her voice was not her voice, and the voices had been singing or chanting or saying something together. And then there had been a door, a great door, and it had been closing, closing, and the light had been bright, brighter than anything in a dream, brighter than the sun, brighter than the hospital window. And she had felt nothing but peace, the kind of peace that comes when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and someone has taken it from you. She did not speak of it. She did not mention it at the hospital. She did not mention it during the drive home. When she walked into the house, she stopped in the hallway because the air was different. The cold was gone. The silence was not the silence of a house that had forgotten how to speak. It was the silence of a house that was breathing again. Noah was in the living room, watching cartoons. He turned when Claire entered. He smiled. His smile was ordinary, the smile of a 5-year-old boy who had been missing his big sister and was glad she was home. Claire knelt beside him. She pulled him into her arms. He was warm. He smelled of crayons and peanut butter and the ordinary smells of a child's life. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you too," he said. Robert stood in the doorway. He watched them. He said nothing. He did not want to cry in front of them. He walked to the kitchen and made coffee, and he stood at the window and drank it. And he looked out at the churchyard, where the grass was beginning to turn green again, where the spring was coming, where the trees were budding, where the fox had not been seen for 3 days, because the fox had been watching something that had ended, and foxes do not watch things that have ended, not for long. Daniel visited on Sunday. He brought a Bible, though it was not a Bible he had brought before. He sat with Claire and her family in the dining room, and he told them a story. He told them about the archive, about the ledger, about the names, about the founding of the town, about the botched rite and the incomplete ritual and the door that had been standing ajar for 230 years. He told them about Ambrose, and about the choice he made, and about the price he paid. He did not lie. He did not omit. He told them the truth, as much of it as they could bear, and he watched their faces as he spoke, and he saw Margaret's hands tremble, and Robert's jaw tighten, and Claire's eyes widen, and Noah draw a door on a piece of paper, this time with the handle on the inside, as though the door could now be opened, if one wanted, or closed, if one preferred. "It is over," Daniel said, when he finished. "The entity is gone. The door is sealed. Noah is safe. Claire is well. Why did it happen here? Robert asked. Because we live here, Daniel said. Because our ancestors made a mistake, and the mistake has been waiting for us to notice it. Because evil is often just a debt, unpaid, accumulating interest, waiting for someone to decide to pay it. Margaret crossed herself. She reached across the table and took Daniel's hand. We cannot repay him, she said. Father Ambrose. You repay him, Daniel said, by living, by not forgetting, by remembering that the church has a secret, and that the secret is ours now, and that we must keep it, so that no one else opens the door. Claire looked at the window. The sun was bright. The birds were singing. The world was ordinary, and it was beautiful, and it was theirs, and she understood, without understanding, that she had been a part of something no one else would ever know, and that the price of that knowing was forgetting, and that she had forgotten, and that she would never remember, and that this was the mercy. No one mentioned the boy who had died in 1987. No one mentioned the other children. No one mentioned the names. The names were written in the ledger, in the archive, in the pages of the red book that Daniel placed in the grave beside Ambrose's body when he buried the old priest in the parish cemetery, on a hill high above the town, where the wind came off the river and the sun set in the winter, and the foxes sat on the graves and watched the light go out. The news did not report the death of an elderly retired priest. The diocese issued a brief statement. The funeral was held on Saturday. The pews were full. Daniel said Mass. He said the words. He looked at the congregation, and he saw the faces of men and women who had lived in the town for generations, who had grown up with the same stories, the same silences, the same doors they had never noticed, and he understood that the secret was not the entity. The secret was the debt. The secret was the choice. The secret was the 230 years of people who had been interrupted, hosts who had been used, vessels who had been emptied, and who had gone on living ordinary lives, ordinary deaths, carrying nothing but a blank spot in memory where the truth should have been. He closed the archive after the funeral. He placed a new lock on the door. He kept the key in his desk, in a drawer he did not open often, in a room he did not enter unless he needed to. He told the diocese that the records were being consolidated. He told no one else about the basement. That spring, Claire went back to school. She had missed 6 weeks. She caught up. She did not speak of her illness. Her friends asked, and she shrugged, and she said it had been a fever, a bad one, that had made her confused. No one pushed. That was the nature of the aftermath. Daniel understood. The need to forget, stronger than the need to know. Noah drew doors. He drew them on paper, on blackboards, on the sidewalk with chalk. His parents bought him sketchbooks, because Margaret said it was creative and Robert said it was quiet, and they did not want to think about why the boy chose to draw doors, yellow doors, doors with handles on the inside, doors that looked like the gates of churches, doors that looked like the entrances to basements, doors that looked like the openings of tombs. Daniel visited the Whitfields every Sunday. He brought bread. He sat in the kitchen. He watched Noah draw. He watched Claire read. He watched Margaret and Robert move through the house with the careful steps of people who know that the world is fragile and who have decided, after everything, to live in it anyway. In June, a woman left flowers on Ambrose's grave. Daniel did not see her. He heard about it from the sexton, who told him that someone had come on a Tuesday morning before dawn and placed a bouquet of white roses on the stone and had left without a name, without a note, without any mark but the flowers themselves. Daniel went to the grave on Wednesday. The roses were there, fresh, their stems wrapped in brown paper, thorns still on the stems. He sat beside the grave. He looked out over the town, spread below him in the valley, the houses small and ordinary, the river moving slowly, the church steeple rising above the trees like a finger pointing at a sky that had finally, after 230 years, stopped holding its breath. He thought about the debt. He thought about the 13th. He thought about the way the entity had waited, patient and thorough, and the way a single man, in the dark, in a basement, with nothing but a red book and a dull knife, had decided to pay it. He placed his hand on the grass. It was green. It was warm. It was ordinary. 13 was refused, he said aloud. It is over. The wind moved through the trees. It carried the smell of the river and the grass and the coming summer. It did not smell of stone. It did not smell of old burial. It did not smell of the dark. Daniel stood. He walked back down the hill. He returned to the rectory. He sat at his desk. He took the ledger from the shelf and opened it to the page where he had written his entry. He took a pen. He wrote one last line, beneath the others, in a hand that was steady, that did not shake, that belonged to a man who had finally stopped waiting for something to move, because it had already moved, and it had already been stopped, and it was done. He closed the book. He returned it to the shelf. He locked the drawer. The afternoon light filled the room. The candles in the church above were not lit. The radio in the kitchen played to him, softly, the ordinary music of an ordinary day. Daniel sat in the chair by the window and watched the garden, where the roses were beginning to bloom, and he thought about Ambrose, who had taught him that sometimes the right thing to do is not the safe thing, and sometimes the safe thing is not enough, and sometimes the debt is paid not by the strong but by the tired, who have been carrying it for so long that they have forgotten there is a price. The light shifted. The shadows moved. The day grew older. Daniel did not move. He did not pray. He simply sat, and he watched the light leave the roses, and he thought, for the first time since he had entered the Whitfield house on a Tuesday evening, that the world might be simpler than he had thought. It was not simpler, of course. It was not simple at all. But for a moment, as the sun went down behind the hill where Ambrose lay, the world was quiet, and the door was closed, and the 13th step had been refused. And that was enough.